In the winter of 1343, in a village called Ashford nestled beneath the grey Yorkshire hills, there lived a washerwoman whose hands had become legends, not for their grace, but for their endurance. This is the story of what those hands survived, and what they learned to hold on to when everything else was slipping away. Hello, dear friend. Come sit with me by the dying fire and let me tell you about Marjorie Thorne, a woman whose life was written not in grand histories, but in the frost that clung to her fingers and the ice that sang beneath her feet. Close your eyes if you wish. This is a story meant to be felt more than seen, understood in the quiet places between sleep and waking. Marjorie was 31 years old in that bitter winter, though you would never have known it from looking at her hands. Those hands belonged to a woman of 60, all cracked leather and dark veins, the knuckles swollen and stiff as old wood. But her face still held something of the girl she had been before the river claimed so many winters of her life. She had gray-green eyes that caught the light like winter ice when it grew thin enough to see through, and her hair, which she kept bound in a linen of the color of old bone, was still more brown than gray, though the gray came further each year. She had been born in Ashford to a tanner's daughter and a man who worked the mill wheel, a man she barely remembered. He had died of a flux when she was 7, his body buried in the frozen ground while snow fell so thick you couldn't see your hand before your face. Her mother had raised her alone in a cottage just outside the village proper, in a small dwelling with a thatch roof that leaked whenever the wind came hard from the north. The cottage still stood. Marjorie lived there still, though now she lived alone as her mother had. For 24 years, Marjorie had been the village washerwoman. It was work that had chosen her as much as she had chosen it, or perhaps chosen it because there was nothing else for a woman with no husband, no father, and no coin. The work required only the river, your strength, and your willingness to endure what the seasons would do to your body. She had learned to endure it. She had learned it so well that the other women of Ashford, the wives of merchants and craftsmen, and the yeoman farmers whose lands lay south of the mill, they simply accepted that Marjorie would come to the riverside to collect their linens on Tuesday morning and return them by Friday, clean and pressed, no matter what the weather. No matter what the weather. It was a promise she had kept for more than 2 decades, and in the winter of 1343, when the cold came early and stayed late, when the frost began in October and did not truly break until April, that promise would cost her everything she had not yet understood she was willing to give. Ashford was a small village, the kind that did not appear on many maps, and held perhaps 200 souls if you count the children, the servants, and the laborers who worked the communal lands. There was the church of St. Michael with its squat stone tower, built by people long dead, whose names no one remembered. There was the manor house where the Lord, Sir Edmund Harwick, lived with his wife and 3 daughters. There was the mill, and the market square where stalls would appear on Sundays after the service, selling wool and cheese and sometimes, if you were lucky, oranges brought from far away. There were the craftsmen's houses, the blacksmith, the cordwainer, the weaver, and scattered beyond these, the cottages of the laborers and servants who kept the village alive. Marjorie's cottage stood about half a mile north of the village proper, on the path toward the moors. It was built of stone her father had helped her mother gather, with walls 2 feet thick that held the cold close through the winter. The roof, which had been repaired more times than she could count, was currently covered in patches of thatch from 3 different years, each layer visibly different in color. Inside, there was one room where she slept and worked by daylight, a small fireplace where she kept a fire going from autumn until May, and a storeroom in the back where she kept herbs she had dried, a few vegetables from the summer garden, and the salt and soap she made herself during the autumn when the work was lighter. She had no servants, no help. She had no family remaining. Her mother had died 15 years ago in a September fever, and Marjorie had buried her in the churchyard and come home to an empty cottage. She had not married. There had been a boy once, a miller's son named Thomas, who had looked at her with kindness in his dark eyes and asked her father for permission when he was alive. But her father had died before Thomas could save enough money for marriage, and Thomas, faced with the reality of taking on both Marjorie and an aging mother-in-law, had instead married the blacksmith's daughter, who came with a small dowry and parents still living. Marjorie had seen him at church every Sunday for years after, his wife swelling with children, and had long ago made peace with it. Peace was a thing you learned in solitude. You had to, or solitude would break you. The river where she worked was called the Ash. It ran cold and fast from the limestone hills to the north, flowing down through stands of birch and hawthorn before it widened and slowed as it passed near the village. There was a place where the bank leveled out and the water grew shallower, a place where the women had come to wash clothes for generations beyond memory. In the summer, it was almost pleasant. The water, while never warm, was at least not so cold that your hands went numb after an hour. The stones on the river bottom were smooth from centuries of feet, and the willows grew close enough to provide shade. Marjorie had even smiled sometimes in the summer, wringing out linens in the dappled light, listening to the gossip of the other women. But the other women did not come in winter. Only Marjorie came in winter. She came because she had to come, because the Lord's wife and the wives of the wealthier merchants would not do without clean linens simply because of the cold. They came to her at the cottage on Tuesday mornings with their bundles, their undergarments, their head coverings, their kerchiefs, their finest linen that required soft water and careful handling. They paid her in coin, and the coin was what kept her fed through the winter when the garden lay frozen and the storeroom grew gradually emptier. In the winter, the river was a different creature entirely. By December, ice began to form along the edges. By January, there would be a skin of ice across the slower sections, though the fast water in the middle remained liquid, running dark and clear over the stones. Marjorie's work in winter meant breaking through that ice, or, if there was snow, clearing it away to find the water beneath. It meant standing in that water in clothes that would freeze almost solid once she left the river, the weight of the damp linen pulling at her arms. It meant that her hands, immersed in water so cold it made your breath stop short, would emerge first white, then blue, then eventually a kind of dark red that hurt almost as much as the cold itself hurt. She had learned over 24 years how to survive this. She had learned that you could not pause, could not hesitate, because hesitation was what made the pain worse. She had learned that you had to work quickly, with purpose, moving from one piece of linen to the next, the cold work becoming almost rhythmic, almost hypnotic if you let it. She had learned to go numb, not just in body but in mind. This was the trick that had kept her alive through so many winters. Go numb, do the work. Do not think about the work. She had also learned small mercies. She had learned that you could soak the linens first in warm water if you heated it before you left the cottage. It made them easier to clean, and it meant your hands got a few minutes of relative warmth when you plunged them into the soaking water. She had learned to bring a small cloth and to dry her hands as much as possible before putting on her gloves. Gloves she had made herself from wool, which were never truly waterproof, but were better than nothing. She had learned that if you rubbed your hands very vigorously when you first felt them beginning to go numb, sometimes you could keep the worst of the frostbite away. She had learned the signs of when cold had gone too far, when your hands turned a particular shade of waxy pale, and you needed to get inside and slowly, carefully warm them by the fire, no matter how much it hurt. The winter of 1343 was not the first bad winter Marjorie had lived through, but it was perhaps the worst since she had taken up the work. The snow began in late October, something that almost never happened. It began with a few flakes, innocent enough, but then the cold came behind it like a wall, and the snow did not stop. It fell all through November, collecting on the roofs and branches, muffling the world into silence. The village was cut off from the larger towns to the south for weeks at a time. The road became impassable. By December, even the animals were suffering. Marjorie had found a bird near her cottage one morning, frozen solid on the ground, its tiny claws curled and its beak open as if it had been trying to sing even as it died. She had buried it under the snow, saying a small prayer for it, though she wasn't quite sure what prayer was appropriate for a bird. She had never felt particularly safe or held by God, but she had been raised to believe that all creatures belonged to His care, and she tried to extend that same care to the things she encountered that were suffering. The cold was not just cold. It was the kind of cold that made your lungs hurt when you breathed, that made the moisture in your nose and mouth freeze instantly, that seemed to seep through walls and through cloth and through skin, settling somewhere deep in your chest where no amount of fire could fully reach it. The village suffered. There were whispers in the church on Sundays about the hunger coming, about how they should have stored more grain. The Lord's stores were adequate as always. The Lord never went hungry, but the common people were beginning to count carefully, to parcel out what they had. Marjorie had enough to eat, though barely. She had grown thin. Everyone had grown thin. But she had her coin from washing, and the Lord's wife paid her double in winter, recognizing perhaps that the work was harder. So Marjorie could still buy oats and dried peas from the merchant, and she had managed to keep her small store of vegetables. She was not starving, not yet. But she was aware of the possibility of starvation in a way she had never been before. And still, the women came on Tuesday mornings with their bundles. It was on a Tuesday in early February, in that cruelest part of the winter when it seems that the cold will never end, that the world has always been frozen and always will be, that Sir Edmund's wife, Lady Catherine, came to the cottage with a particularly unusual request. Marjorie was sitting by her small fire, repairing a tear in one of her work dresses, when the knock came at the door. She knew it was early for a Tuesday collection. Usually the women came in mid-morning, after the work of the house had begun. But she opened the door anyway, and found not Lady Catherine but her youngest daughter, Eleanor, a girl of perhaps 16, who had the pale, fragile appearance of someone who had never had to do a day's difficult work. Eleanor was shivering, though she wore a cloak lined with fur. She looked frightened in a way that made Marjorie's stomach tighten, with a sympathy she didn't quite want to feel. "My mother wishes to know," Eleanor said, her voice small and wavering, "whether you might come to the manor tomorrow morning. There is a situation that requires discretion." Marjorie had not worked at the manor before. No one did. Lady Catherine's servants handled most of the household work, and Marjorie was simply the village washerwoman, the woman who did the fine work in her river, which was considered somehow separate from the domestic service that happened within the manor walls. But she nodded, and Eleanor nodded in return, looking relieved, and then she left as quickly as she had come. "This opening grows longer still, dear one. The fire is settling, and we are only at the beginning of the story. Marjorie is being drawn into something larger than her usual work, something that will change the course of her winter." The manor in winter. The next morning, Marjorie walked toward the manor house while the sky was still that particular shade of gray that meant dawn, was still thinking about whether it wanted to arrive. The snow crunched under her feet, each step releasing a small sound like bone breaking. Her breath came out in white clouds that froze immediately in the still air. She had brought nothing with her except a small cloth and her gloves, uncertain what work would be required of her. The manor house loomed against the pale sky like something from an older world, all gray stone and narrow windows. It had been built perhaps 100 years before, in a time when men still believed they needed to build defensively, even in the heart of peaceful land. There was a wall around it, half crumbled now, and a gate that stood perpetually open. Marjorie passed through that gate and approached the heavy wooden door, her heart beating in a way that made her angry at herself. She was 41 years old. She had nothing to fear from the nobility. They were simply people, and often not very interesting ones at that. A servant, a woman Marjorie recognized as one who came to the market sometimes, answered the door. Her name was Alice, and she looked harried in a way that went beyond the usual winter tiredness. "The lady is expecting you," Alice said without preamble, and led her through corridors that were warm, genuinely warm, in a way Marjorie's cottage never was, and into a chamber on the upper floor. Lady Catherine was sitting in a chair near a window, and for a moment Marjorie did not recognize her. The lady was perhaps 50, with the kind of appearance that came from living a life of relative ease, her hands smooth and her face unlined by the kind of labor that marked women like Marjorie. But her eyes were red, and her composure, which Marjorie had only ever witnessed as perfect, seemed to be held together by threads. "Marjorie," Lady Catherine said, and gestured for her to come closer. "I have a task that is not ordinary. I must ask for your absolute discretion." Marjorie moved closer, aware that she was tracking small bits of melted snow onto the expensive rushes that covered the floor. She tried to step more carefully. "My youngest child," Lady Catherine continued, "has had a misfortune. A young man from the village. Nothing came of it, but he has left now, gone to his uncle in London, and the matter is closed. However," she paused, and her composure seemed to crack for just a moment before she reassembled it. "However, there are certain linens that require very careful attention. Blood, you understand, from her courses, the blood is excessive. It will not come clean by normal means." Marjorie understood. This was not an uncommon situation, though it was not one that was usually spoken of so directly. She had seen blood on linens before and had known what it meant sometimes. The body was the body, and women bled for many reasons. Some of those reasons were natural and some were not, and Marjorie had learned long ago not to judge, not to speak, not to think too much about what she saw. "I will need the linens," Marjorie said simply, "and information about what has been used to treat them. Lye water will not serve for blood like other stains." Lady Catherine looked at her with something that might have been gratitude. She stood and moved toward a chest in the corner of the chamber, opening it to reveal a bundle of linens wrapped in cloth. Some of them, when Marjorie carefully unfolded them, bore stains that had turned brown with age, from the previous day or perhaps earlier. "I want them returned as new," Lady Catherine said quietly. "I do not care what it costs. I want them pristine, and I want this matter to be between us. You will tell no one." "I tell no one anything," Marjorie said, and it was true. In 24 years of washing the intimate linens of half the village, she had never once gossiped about what she saw. It was an understanding between her and the women she served. The washerwoman kept secrets. That was part of the work. She gathered the bundle, wrapping it carefully in her own cloth, and left the manor without another word. The warmth of the house had made her coat feel heavy and strange, and when she stepped back out into the cold, it felt almost like a relief. The walk back to her cottage took longer than usual because of the weight she was carrying and because of the thoughts in her head. She was thinking about Alina, the girl she had seen at her door the day before. She was thinking about young men and the decisions they made, and the ways those decisions always fell on the women. She was thinking about blood, which was life, and about the body's desperate attempts to hold onto what it needed to live. But mostly, she was not thinking. She had learned a long time ago that thinking too much about the circumstances of her work was a way to become bitter, and bitter was not a luxury she could afford. The blood work. Back in her cottage, Marjorie laid the linens out on her small table and examined them carefully in the thin winter light coming through her window. The stains were old enough that they had set, which made the work harder. Fresh blood could be treated with cold water and time. Old blood required different methods. She had learned her trade thoroughly. There was an art to washing that went beyond simple scrubbing. Different stains required different treatments. Mud came out with gentle brushing and cold water. Grass stains required ash and lye. Wine needed salt and then careful rinsing. But blood was particular. It was protein, and protein responded to certain things. Urine in small quantities was actually useful. Salt could help lift it. And there was an old remedy her mother had taught her, made from a particular root that grew in the meadows in summer, dried and ground into a powder, then made into a paste with water. Marjorie had gathered and dried that root last summer, as she did every summer, even though she often did not need it. She kept it in her storeroom, tied in a cloth bundle, and she retrieved it now. She had perhaps 2 pounds of it left, which should be enough for the work ahead. She spent the rest of the morning preparing. She heated water in her large iron pot, the one she used for the preliminary soaking of particularly dirty linens. She ground the dried root into powder using a mortar and pestle that had belonged to her mother. She mixed the powder with a small amount of cold water to form a paste, and then she took each linen piece and carefully applied the paste to the stained areas, working it gently into the fibers with her fingers. The work was not difficult, but it was precise. It required attention. It required the kind of focus that was actually restful, in its way. Her mind could go quiet while her hands moved through the familiar motions. Marjorie had discovered long ago that this quiet was something she needed, something that her body required in order to keep going. Too much thinking made her sad. The quiet made her able to continue. By midday, she had treated all the linens, and they were now lying in a clean basin, covered with cold water, where they would sit for 2 days. In that time, the paste would begin to break down the old blood, loosening it from the fibers. Then she would rinse them and do the actual washing, and if she was careful and patient, they should come clean. She had other work to do in the meantime. She had linens from the village women waiting, work that had come in on Tuesday morning. She could not neglect that work for the lady's linens, no matter how much coin the lady was paying. The regular work was what kept her alive. But as she moved through the afternoon, working on the merchant's wife's undergarments, her mind kept returning to Alina, to the blood she had seen on those linens, to the way Lady Catherine's composure had cracked for just a moment. She thought about the young man who had gone to London. She thought about the decisions people made, and the ways those decisions left marks that could not be fully washed away, no matter how careful the work. The frost gets worse. The weather, if it was possible, grew worse. By the second week of February, the snow had fallen so deeply that paths had to be dug through it. The village was struggling. There had been sickness, a cough that moved from house to house, and at least 2 deaths that Marjorie knew of, both of them in families who lived on the margins, who did not have enough food or enough fuel for the fire. She had seen the bodies being carried to the church for burial, and she had said prayers for them, though she still was not entirely sure if her prayers meant anything. The washing work did not stop, even in this worst weather. If anything, it increased. People were spending more time inside, and more time inside meant more linens needing washing. Marjorie went to the river every other day now, sometimes even more frequently. Her hands, despite all her careful preparations and all the knowledge she had accumulated over decades, were beginning to show signs of serious damage. The chilblains had started in her fingers in January, but by mid-February, they had spread to the joints of her hands, to her knuckles, to the spaces between her fingers. Chilblains were small blisters that formed when the skin was damaged by repeated freezing and thawing. They itched and burned in a way that was almost worse than the original cold, because the cold at least had the mercy of numbness. The itching of chilblains was an active torment, one that kept her awake at night. She also had cracks in her skin that had opened so deeply that they bled sometimes. On the worst days, her hands would bleed while she was working, and the blood would mix with the river water, and she would have to stop and wrap her hands tightly in cloth to stem the flow before going back to work. She tried to work through it. There was nothing else to do. One particularly cold morning, it was the 15th of February, a Tuesday, Marjorie woke to find that her left hand had swollen significantly overnight. The swelling was not the normal swelling that came from the chilblains. It was hot, and when she pressed on it, a clear fluid came away on her finger. An infection, then. She could see the line of red that ran from the base of her fingers up toward her wrist. She sat for a long moment, looking at her hand, and felt something close to despair. An infection in the winter was a serious matter. People died of infections. People died of lesser things than infections. And yet she had work to do. The linens from the ladies' manor needed to be finished. They had been soaking for the required time now, and the village women were expecting their washing to be done today. She wrapped her infected hand carefully in a clean cloth and made a compress from comfrey leaves and honey. The honey she had been saving, had been keeping for a real emergency, and this qualified. She applied it to the wound as best she could, then bound it all together with a strip of linen torn from an old underdress. Then she gathered her things, her bar of soap made from lye and fat, the brush made from horsehair, the wooden beaters that she used to force the dirt out of the cloth, and she set out for the river. The walk to the river took longer than usual because she was moving carefully, conscious of not jostling her hand. The pain was a constant thing now, a throbbing that matched her heartbeat. The morning was so cold that her breath froze almost immediately, forming little crystals of ice in the air that caught what pale light there was. Her feet crunched on the snow. Everything was white and gray and the pale blue of ice. There was no color in the world anymore. There had been no real color since October. At the river, the work was harder than usual. The ice on the banks had thickened, and she had to use a knife to break through it, which she had not needed to do before. The water was so cold that even looking at it made her teeth ache. But she set up her workspace, breaking through the ice to create an opening where she could work, and she began the slow process of washing the linens that had been commissioned from her. She started with ordinary work, the merchant's wife's linens, the chemises and the head coverings, and the undergarments that required simple washing. She worked through these with her one good hand and her infected hand, which she tried to keep as still as possible. The pain was becoming interesting in an abstract way, as if it was happening to someone else, someone she was observing rather than someone she was. Halfway through the morning, as she was reaching for one of the linens to rinse it, her infected hand suddenly burst. The abscess that had been forming under the skin ruptured, and pus came away on her glove. She had to stop work, remove the glove, and clean her hand in the ice-cold water. The cold actually felt good against the burning of the infection. She let her hand rest in the water for a moment, just long enough for the pain to recede slightly. Then she wrapped it again and went back to work. She would not remember, later, much of that day. She would remember the cold and the pain, and she would remember the whiteness of the sky. She would remember the feeling of her movements becoming automatic, as if her body was separate from her mind, and was simply going through the motions of the work without consulting with her about whether it should continue. She would remember the moment when she realized she could no longer feel her fingers, and the moment after that when she realized this was perhaps a mercy. By late afternoon, as the pale winter light was beginning to fade, she had finished the ordinary work. The linens were clean and rinsed, and she was laying them out on the rocks to dry as much as possible before she would take them back to the village to hang by fires. This was a luxury, using the rocks to dry them because it meant they would come back in better condition, less frozen. But the rocks held just enough residual warmth. From where? She did not know. From some deeper part of the earth, perhaps, that the cold had not yet reached. As she was laying out the last of the ordinary linens, she lifted her bundle for the lady's work, the blood-stained pieces that had been soaking in cold water for the past several days. It was time to actually wash them now. Marjorie had learned over the years that the hardest part of any work was not the work itself, but the moment you had to begin again, had to return to the task. It was easiest to keep working if you never stopped. But stopping and then starting again required a kind of courage that she had to summon from somewhere inside herself, somewhere deep and quiet. She summoned it now. She took out the first of the lady's linens, a fine piece of cloth that had probably cost more than Marjorie made in a month. The paste she had applied had done its work. The old blood had begun to loosen, to separate from the fibers, but it was still there, still visible, still in need of careful, patient work. She began to wash it, working the cloth gently between her hands, letting the cold water do the work of lifting the stain. Her left hand, the infected one, screamed with pain every time she moved it, but she moved it anyway because there was work to be done, and this was what it meant to do work. You did the work even when your body was telling you to stop. The blood came away gradually. It was not dramatic. It was not a sudden transformation. It was a slow fade, like a ghost becoming less visible as dawn approached, until finally there was nothing left but the faintest trace, visible only if you looked for it in certain light. Marjorie had learned that this was usually enough. People wanted their linens clean, but they did not expect them to be absolutely perfect. They were not willing to pay for absolute perfection. But the lady had said she wanted them returned as new. Marjorie worked on. She scrubbed the spot where the blood had been with her horsehair brush, very gently, trying not to damage the delicate weave of the cloth. The brush was harsh against the fine material, but she knew how to modulate her pressure, how much force she could use before it became damaging. She had been doing this work for 24 years. If she did not know by now, she never would. Gradually, the stain faded until it was barely visible. Marjorie rinsed the linen in clean water, cold water, of course. All the water was cold now, and held it up to the failing light. In this light, you could not see the stain at all. The linen looked new. It looked as it must have looked when it first came from the loom, pristine and untouched. She washed the rest of the ladies' linens, using the same careful technique. By the time she had finished, the light had almost completely gone. The winter darkness came early and stayed late, and by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it was essentially night. She had to stop working because she could no longer see clearly enough to be certain whether the work was being done properly. She gathered all the linens, arranging them carefully in her basket so that they would not wrinkle. Her infected hand had stopped hurting, which she knew was not a good sign. It meant the pain was becoming too much for her body to register, or it meant that the infection was shutting down the normal functioning of her nerves. Either way, it was not good. She made her way back to the village in the darkness, navigating by memory more than by sight. The snow was a pale gray in the starlight, and the path was a darker gray line running through it. Her feet knew the way, even when her eyes could not quite see it. The lady pays her debt. It was late when she reached her cottage. She was so tired that she could barely stay awake long enough to lock the door and build up her fire to a decent level. She hung the damp linens from the hooks she had driven into the beams of her ceiling. There were so many linens hanging there now that she could barely move through the cottage without pushing them out of her way. Then she sat by the fire, holding her infected hand near the warmth, but not too near. You had to be careful with infected wounds. They could become worse if you heated them too quickly. And she tried to remember if she had eaten anything that day. She had not. She was too tired to eat. She drank some water, standing in her small room, and then she lay down on her pallet and fell into a sleep so deep it was almost like drowning. She woke in the night to the sound of someone knocking on her door. For a moment, she could not remember where she was or what year it was or who she was. Then the knocking came again, insistent and loud, and she remembered. She pulled herself up from her pallet, her body protesting with a pain that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and opened the door. It was Eleanor, the lady's daughter, shivering in the darkness in a cloak that was not nearly warm enough for the weather. "My mother sent me," Eleanor said without preamble. "She says that you took ill. The linens were returned this afternoon. They are perfect. She says she asked me to come and give you this." Eleanor held out a cloth-wrapped package, and Marjorie, still half asleep and confused, took it. "You should not have come out in the dark," Marjorie said, though she was not sure why she cared. Eleanor was not her concern. The lady was not her concern. She was simply the washerwoman. "My mother was worried," Eleanor said. "She says she has heard that the infection in your hand is serious." "Is it? Will you be all right?" Marjorie looked down at her left hand, which was still swollen and aching, even in its sleep-numb state. "I will be well enough," she said, because this was what people said when they were uncertain. Eleanor nodded and then turned to leave, but Marjorie found herself calling after her. "The blood," she said quietly. "It is gone. The linens are clean. It is as though it never was." Eleanor paused at the edge of the firelight. She was just a girl, really, though the laws of the land said she was old enough to be married, old enough to have responsibilities. She had the look of someone who had been through something that had aged her, marked her in some invisible way. "Thank you," Eleanor said, and then she was gone, disappearing into the darkness like a ghost. Marjorie stood at her door for a moment, holding the cloth-wrapped package, and then she went back inside and opened it by firelight. Inside the package were 3 things. First, there was a small leather purse containing coins, more coins than the lady had promised to pay for the work, more coins than Marjorie had made in months. There were easily 5 shillings there, which was a fortune to her. 5 shillings would buy her food for 2 months, could buy her new gloves, could mean that she would not have to scrape every resource into the fire to stay warm. Second, there was a jar of something thick and dark, with a note written in a careful hand. "For your hand. My physician's remedy for infection. It is blessed. Use it twice daily." Third, there was a small vial of liquid. The note explained, "Poppy. For the pain. 3 drops in warm water when the pain becomes unbearable." Marjorie sat by her fire, holding these objects, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt something that might have been hope. Or it might have been the poppy, she was not sure. She did not remember taking any, but her exhaustion was suddenly immense, crushing, and she lay back on her pallet and returned to the deep sleep that had been interrupted by Eleanor's knock. The fever comes. The infection did not improve with the physician's remedy, though it did not worsen as rapidly as it might have. For 3 more days, Marjorie continued her work despite the heat in her hand, despite the way her whole body was beginning to ache in a way that went beyond the normal aches of a woman who spent her days in cold water. On the 3rd day, she realized that her body was burning up, that when she plunged her infected hand into the river water, the water felt almost warm. She had a fever. She knew the signs. She had seen fever enough times to know what it meant. Fever was the body's way of trying to burn away the infection, but it could also burn away the person entirely if it got hot enough. She made it through Wednesday and then Thursday. On Friday, when she tried to get up to do her work, she found that she could not stand. Her legs would not hold her. She fell back onto her pallet and lay there, aware in a distant way that this was a problem, that the linens were waiting, that people were counting on her. She did not have the energy to care. What happened over the next few days was not entirely clear to her later. There were parts of it that she remembered with perfect clarity, and other parts that had become mixed with dreams, so that she was no longer certain what had been real and what had been her fever mind making things up. She remembered the cold, even though her body was burning. She remembered waking in the darkness to find that the fire had gone out, and she had tried to build it up again, but her hands would not obey her. She remembered lying on her pallet and thinking that this was probably how it would end. This was probably the way that all the washerwoman's winters would finally accumulate into this one, the winter that would take her. She remembered at some point, it might have been the second day or the fourth day. She was not sure, hearing a knock at the door. She had wanted to answer it, but she could not move, so she had simply lain there while the knocking continued. Then the sound of the door being broken open, and the voice of someone she did not recognize. It was Alice, the servant from the manor house. She was followed by a young man carrying wood and what looked like supplies. They had come, somehow, from the manor. "The lady said you did not come," Alice was saying. "She said you had not been to collect the new linens in 3 days. She sent me to check if you were well, and when I saw the state of the place..." Alice was doing things, building up the fire, arranging cloth around Marjorie to keep her warm. "God's wounds, you are burning up. We need to get your fever down." The young man, who Marjorie would later learn was the manor's farrier, began mixing something with water, herbs, she thought, though the fever made everything seem unreal. He helped Alice prop her up enough to drink the mixture, and it was bitter and made her cough. But after she had drunk it, she was aware that her mind felt slightly less clouded. "The linens," Marjorie said. She was not even sure she said it aloud, or if she only thought it. "Never mind the linens," Alice said. "The lady said to tell you that if you die, we will never forgive you for putting us in such a position. So you must not die, you understand? You must get well, because the lady is a practical woman, and she did not send us all the way out here for nothing." This was kindness disguised as a threat, and Marjorie, even in her fevered state, recognized it and was grateful for it. The slow return. The fever lasted another 3 days, though by the end of those 3 days, it had broken to the point where Marjorie could stay awake for longer periods. Alice came every day, bringing food from the manor and ensuring that Marjorie ate it. The young farrier came to build up the fire and to bring more supplies. They did not speak much. There was not much to say, but their presence was like ballast, like something that kept Marjorie from sinking entirely. By the end of the week, the fever had broken entirely, and Marjorie was awake enough to be aware of her situation and to feel the weight of guilt that came with it. She had not worked in a week. There were probably linens waiting to be done. The village women would be wondering where she was. "You need to rest for another week at least," Alice said firmly, when Marjorie tried to get up. "You are weak as a newborn foal. The river will still be there in a week." "My work," Marjorie began. "Your work will wait. The lady has sent word to the village that you are ill. She has told them that you will resume your work when you are able. They will understand." This was something that Marjorie had not expected. She had imagined that her illness meant the end of her work, that the women of the village would, in her absence, discover that they could manage without her or find someone else to do the work. But it seemed the lady had protected her in some way and had ensured her place by speaking for her. It took another week before Marjorie had enough strength to leave her cottage. When she finally did, it was a cold, clear morning in late February, and the world seemed almost achingly beautiful in its severity. The snow was still deep, but the very worst of the winter seemed to have passed. There was a feeling in the air, a change in the quality of the light, perhaps, or the way the wind blew, that suggested spring was coming, eventually, if the world could just survive long enough to reach it. Her infected hand was healed now, the infection gone, leaving only scars and a weakness that would probably never entirely go away. She could move her fingers, though with less flexibility than before, and with a pain that came and went. But it was a pain she could live with. It was not the kind of pain that stopped her from working. She returned to the river, and the work resumed. Eleanor's confession. It was in late March, when the worst of the snow had finally begun to melt, and the world was emerging from its frozen state like something being born, that Eleanor came to visit Marjorie's cottage again. This time it was in daylight in the early afternoon, and Eleanor was alone. Marjorie was hanging linens to dry outside, a luxury of the warming weather, when she saw the girl approaching. She was dressed simply, in a way that might have been meant to seem less conspicuous than the fine clothes she usually wore. "I wanted to thank you," Eleanor said without preamble, "for what my mother told me. She said that you did not speak of what she asked you to do, that you did not tell anyone, did not judge. She said that is a kind of grace." Marjorie continued hanging linens, her hands moving in the familiar rhythm. "There is nothing to thank me for. I did my work." "But you did more than that," Eleanor said. She was standing on the path, not quite at the door to the cottage, as if she was not sure whether she should fully commit to the visit. "You did your work, but you also kept a secret. That is a different thing. That is a choice." Marjorie turned to look at her. Eleanor was pale in the spring light, thinner than she had been in winter, with dark circles under her eyes that suggested she was not sleeping well. She was also older somehow, or at least she carried herself with a different kind of weight, as if something had happened that had required her to grow up more than the mere passage of months should have required. "The young man," Marjorie said carefully. "The one who went to London." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but she held her head steady. "I was foolish," she said. "I thought I loved him. I thought he loved me, but he was weak, and when things became difficult, he left. My mother helped me. She sent me to a physician, a real physician, not the one who tends the village people, and she paid for his silence and my recovery. If it had been known, if the village had known, my sisters would not have marriages now. My father would have sent me away. My mother protected me, and you protected us both by not speaking of what you saw." Marjorie was quiet for a long moment. She was thinking about the blood on those linens, about the fact that what she had washed away had probably been the evidence of Eleanor's desperate attempt to undo what had been done to her body. She was thinking about how many secrets of this kind existed in villages like Ashford, how many women had to manage the consequences of their own flesh, how many men got to walk away to London and never think of it again. "The world is hard on women," Marjorie said finally. "There is not much we can do about that. But we can be kind to each other. That is something." Eleanor nodded, and then she smiled, and it was a real smile, one that suggested that maybe the girl was going to be all right, was going to survive what had happened to her. "I wanted you to know," Eleanor said, "that my mother and I are grateful, and that when I marry, I am to be married in June to the younger son of a merchant in York. I will not forget you. I will tell my own children that there was a washerwoman in my village who was kind, who did not judge, who kept her silence even though others might not have. I will tell them that grace is a thing that ordinary people can have, and that it matters more than we usually think." After Eleanor had gone, Marjorie stood in her yard with a linen in her hands, and she wept. She was not entirely sure why. Perhaps it was because kindness was rarer than she had realized. Perhaps it was because Eleanor had seen her, really seen her, and had decided that she was worthy of respect. Or perhaps she was simply tired, and the winter had been long, and her body and her mind were releasing something that had been held tight since October. The spring work. March turned into April, and April began to warm in the way that spring warmed, with days that were genuinely mild, that made you believe winter was truly over. The snow melted in great rushing streams that flowed toward the river, and the river itself grew swollen and dangerous with the melt. Marjorie had to adjust her work, moving to a different spot where the water was less violent, where the current was strong but not quite so dangerous as to make the work impossible. The other women began to return to the river now that the weather was improving. In summer, they would come regularly, taking turns, so that there would always be several of them working at once. But in spring, they came sporadically, testing the waters, making sure it was not still too cold, that the worst of winter was truly over. One of the first to return was the merchant's wife, Anne, who had been giving Marjorie work for nearly 10 years. She came to the river on an April morning when the sun was actually warm on your skin, when the branches of the willows were beginning to show tiny buds of green. "You look poorly," Anne said without bothering with any preamble. Anne was a practical woman who had no patience for pleasantries. "I was ill in February," Marjorie said. "An infection in my hand. It has healed." Anne examined her hand, which Marjorie held out for inspection. The scars were visible, raised and pale against the skin, and her hand was thinner than it had been before, the muscles not yet fully recovered. "The Lord's wife paid you well for your discretion," Anne said. Marjorie did not ask how Anne knew this. Women talked, and the women who came to Ashford Market talked more than most. The fact that Eleanor had been sent to a physician and that the lady had been concerned for Marjorie would have been known, and people would have drawn their own conclusions about what it meant. "She did," Marjorie said simply. Anne nodded, satisfied. "My daughter, my youngest, will need similar discretion in a few years if the world does not change. I wanted to know that I could trust you. Now I know I can." It was not gratitude exactly that Anne was offering. It was more practical than that. It was the kind of assurance that came from knowing that there were people in the world who would not judge you, who would keep quiet, who would do their work and not make your life more difficult than it already was. Marjorie understood. She had been offered, in a way, a kind of status in the community. She had become the woman who kept secrets, the woman who could be trusted to manage the intimate, shameful things that happened to women and to keep them hidden. It was not a status that had been sought by Marjorie, but it was one that came with a kind of power. The power that came from knowledge, yes, but also the power that came from people's gratitude for her silence. The wound that heals wrong. By May, Marjorie's hand seemed to be almost fully recovered. The scars remained, but they were pale now, less visible. She had full mobility in her fingers again, though the grip was not as strong as it had been. But as the month progressed, she began to notice something else. Her hand was hurting more, not less. And the pain was not the sharp pain of a wound healing, but a dull, aching pain that seemed to come from the bones themselves. She tried to ignore it. There was work to be done, and pain was simply part of the work. She had spent so many years ignoring the pain of her hands that this seemed like a reasonable approach. But the pain grew worse as the summer came. By July, she was aware that something was wrong. The scar tissue had tightened as it healed, and the tendons beneath it had shortened. Her hand was beginning to curl, just slightly, as if it wanted to make a fist but could not quite manage it. When she held the linens to wring them, she could no longer apply the pressure she once had. Her grip was weak. One particularly hot day in late July, when the sun had been beating down on the river since morning and the heat seemed almost oppressive after the long, cold winter, Marjorie was working on a particularly stubborn stain, wine, or perhaps blood. She could not quite tell, when her hand suddenly refused to obey her. The muscles simply would not flex properly. The linen slipped from her grip and fell into the river, carried away downstream by the current before she could catch it. She stood there, waist deep in the river, watching the linen disappear around the bend, and she felt something break inside her that was not her body. It was something in her spirit, some part of her that had held firm through all the winters, through the illness, through the long years of cold water and pain. She waded back to the shore and sat down on the warm rocks, her wet skirts clinging to her legs. Her left hand was trembling, and she could not make it stop. She looked at it as if it belonged to someone else, someone she did not know and did not particularly like. The other woman working near her, it was Martha, the blacksmith's wife, came over to see if Marjorie was all right. "I lost a linen," Marjorie said. It was a small thing, really. Linens could be replaced, but it felt significant in a way that she could not quite explain. "It happens," Martha said kindly. "These things happen. The river is strong." But that was not really what had happened. What had happened was that Marjorie's hand had failed her. What had happened was that the infection from the winter had damaged something fundamental, something that all her careful work through the spring and early summer had not been able to fully repair. That evening, back at her cottage, Marjorie spent a long time looking at her two hands. Her right hand was still strong. The grip was firm, the fingers flexible, the scars from years of work visible but not debilitating. But her left hand was different now. It was weaker. The scars pulled tight when she tried to make certain motions. The joint at her wrist sometimes gave way without warning, making her drop things. She realized, sitting there as the light faded, that her career as she had known it might be coming to an end. Not immediately, perhaps. She could still do the work, still wash the linens, but she would not be able to do it as she had done it for 24 years. She would not be able to do it with the same strength, the same speed, the same certainty. The thought terrified her in a way that nothing had terrified her since she was a child. The visitor in the dark. It was late August when the letter came. A letter was an unusual thing for Marjorie to receive. Letters were for people who had family, who had connections to the wider world. But this letter came from Eleanor, now Eleanor Harrington, married to the merchant's son and living in York. Alice, the servant, brought it from the manor, riding out to Marjorie's cottage on a day when she had business in the village. Marjorie could read, though not well. Her mother had taught her, insisting that it was important that a woman should know how to read and write at least the basic things. So Marjorie sat by her window with the letter and slowly worked through it, sounding out the words. Eleanor wrote that she was well, that she was with child, that the physician believed the child would come in November. She wrote that she was grateful, always grateful, for what Marjorie had done. She wrote that she had thought Marjorie should know. The young man had written to Eleanor's father, expressing remorse, asking to be forgiven. He had not done it from goodness, Eleanor suspected, but from his own conscience or from fear of what Eleanor's father might do if they met again. Eleanor's father had written back a careful letter, neither forgiving nor condemning, but suggesting that the man's best course was to continue his life in London and not attempt to contact any member of Eleanor's family again. Eleanor wrote, "I think of you often, and especially I think of your hands. I remember seeing them when you came to the manor, how marked they were, how they told the story of all your years of labor. I wanted you to know that I have not forgotten. I wanted you to know that what you did for me was an act of grace, and that grace matters. I pray for you, and I will teach my child, when the child comes, to be grateful for the ordinary kindness of ordinary people. You are not ordinary, Marjorie. I hope you know that." Marjorie read the letter 3 times slowly, working through the words. Then she set it carefully on her small shelf, in a place of honor next to a candle that had belonged to her mother. The autumn returns. As August turned into September, the first hints of autumn began to appear. The leaves of the willow trees started to show colors at their edges, yellows and golds and reds. The nights grew cooler. The river, which had been warm enough in August to splash and laugh if you were a young person, began to cool again. And Marjorie, who had lived through this cycle so many times that it seemed like the only real rhythm in the world, found herself preparing for another winter. But this winter will be different. Her hand was not healing the way she had hoped it would. In September, when she was working, her left hand gave out entirely on a day when the weather was gray and cold, and suggested that autumn was going to be a serious one. She was wringing a particularly heavy linen, a tablecloth from the Lord's own household, and something in her wrist simply surrendered. The tendons, already weakened and scarred, could not take the pressure. She felt something tear, felt the sharp pain that indicated real damage rather than just the normal ache of cold work. She managed to finish wringing the linen with one hand, managing a kind of modified technique that worked but was far slower than the proper way. Then she waded out of the river and sat on the rocks and looked at her hand, which was already beginning to swell. It was Martha who found her there, still sitting on the rocks an hour later, staring at her hand as if it belonged to someone else. "Marjorie," Martha said, her voice concerned. "Marjorie, are you all right?" "My hand," Marjorie said. She was not sure how to explain the enormity of what had just happened, so she simply held it out for Martha to see. Martha examined it carefully, moving the swollen wrist gently, watching Marjorie's face to see where it hurt. "You have damaged it," Martha said finally. "Badly. You need to see a physician." "There is no physician in Ashford," Marjorie said. "No, but the Lord can send for one from York. Or Eleanor. Eleanor's husband must know physicians." Marjorie shook her head. She did not want to trouble Eleanor again, did not want to seem ungrateful or needy. She wanted to manage her own life, her own body, the way she always had. But Martha was having none of it. She helped Marjorie to her feet and essentially escorted her back to the village, to the manor house, where she insisted on speaking to someone about what had happened. Marjorie protested the entire way, but Martha was a solid, immovable force, and by the time they reached the manor, Marjorie had stopped protesting and simply allowed herself to be carried along. Lady Catherine received them in the same room where Marjorie had first come to collect the blood-stained linens all those months ago. The lady examined Marjorie's hand and pronounced it serious but probably not permanently damaging if it was treated correctly and allowed to rest. "You will not be able to work for at least 6 weeks," Lady Catherine said firmly. "Possibly longer. The tendon has been damaged, but if you do not use the hand, if you let it heal slowly and carefully, it should regain some of its strength." "I cannot not work," Marjorie said. "I have no income if I do not work." "Then that is a problem we must solve," Lady Catherine said. And before Marjorie could protest further, before she could say all the things she wanted to say about not being charity and not wanting to be a burden, Lady Catherine was speaking to Alice, giving her instructions. Within the hour, Marjorie found herself taken to a small room in the manor house, a servant's room, but still a room in the manor. She was given a bed, a real bed with clean linens and a straw mattress, and she was told that she would stay there until her hand had healed enough for her to return to work. "You will have light work," Lady Catherine said. "Mending, if you can manage it with one hand. Sorting of linens, organizing the stores, nothing that strains your left hand, and you will be fed, of course. You will stay until you are well." Marjorie wanted to argue. She wanted to insist that she could not possibly accept such generosity, that it was too much, that it was not proper. But she was exhausted in a way that went beyond the normal tiredness of her work. She was exhausted in her soul, in her spirit. And she was also terrified of what would happen if she did not accept help, what would happen to her if her hand did not heal, if she could not work anymore at all. So she accepted. She stayed at the manor house. The autumn rest. The 6 weeks that followed were strange and dislocating in a way that Marjorie had not anticipated. She had spent almost her entire adult life in solitude in her cottage, doing her own work at her own pace. The manor house was full of people, servants moving constantly, the sounds of the household going about its business, the rhythm of work that was not her work. But it was also, she found, not entirely unpleasant. Lady Catherine was kind, but in a way that was not sentimental. She did not fuss over Marjorie or treat her as an invalid. She simply gave her tasks that could be done with one hand, and Marjorie did them. Sorting linens, mending small tears, organizing the storeroom. The work was gentler than the river work, but it was still work, and Marjorie found comfort in that. The other servants were curious about her at first. The washerwoman, brought into the manor house like a stray cat someone had decided to keep. But they grew used to her quickly, and by the end of the 2nd week, she was accepted as a simple part of the household. A woman named Sarah, who was perhaps 10 years younger than Marjorie and worked as a cook, took a particular interest in her. "You have been washing our linens for how long?" Sarah asked one day, as they were working together sorting cloth. 24 years, Marjorie said. Sarah whistled low. "That is a long time. And your hands, everyone knows your hands. The lady told me what happened to you in the winter. She said you nearly died." "I was ill," Marjorie said. "But I recovered." "But your hand did not fully recover," Sarah said. "It was not a question. My mother was a washerwoman before she married my father. She lost the use of her hands when she was about your age. The cold got to her, and the repeated damage, and eventually her hands simply stopped working. She stopped doing the washing and started helping my father in his trade. But it broke her spirit, I think. She wanted to be a washerwoman. It was what she knew how to do." Marjorie was quiet for a long moment. She was thinking about what it meant to have your work taken away from you, to have your identity stripped away not by choice but by the failure of your body. It was something she had feared for years now, had known was coming eventually, but knowing and experiencing were different things. "What does she do now?" Marjorie asked. "She keeps house for my father," Sarah said. "She is content, I think. Or at least she has become content. It took time." It was not a comforting answer exactly, but it was an honest one, and Marjorie appreciated that. The hand heals differently. As October progressed, Marjorie's hand did begin to heal. The swelling went down. The color returned to normal. She began to be able to bend her wrist slightly without acute pain. But when she tried to use the hand for anything requiring real strength, wringing a cloth, lifting something heavy, she found that it simply could not do it. The hand was weak in a way that seemed to go beyond just the normal weakness of disuse. One day, almost exactly 6 weeks after her injury, Lady Catherine came to find her in the storeroom where she was working. "How is your hand?" the lady asked. Marjorie held it out. It looked almost normal now. The scars from the winter infection were still visible, but they were pale and not obviously damaged. But when she tried to make a fist, the hand only partially complied. The little finger and the ring finger would not curl all the way. The movement was weak and incomplete. "I fear," Marjorie said slowly, "that I may not be able to do the work as I did before. The ringing, the heavy work, I do not think my hand can manage it." Lady Catherine examined it carefully, moving her fingers, testing the range of motion. "You were a washerwoman for 24 years, she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Marjorie said. "And before that?" "Before that, I was my mother's daughter. She was a washerwoman as well. I grew up learning the work." Lady Catherine nodded thoughtfully. "So you have perhaps 30 years of experience with washing linens. You know the work as few people know it. You know quality. You know how different linens should be treated. You know all the small secrets that make the difference between adequate work and excellent work." "Yes," Marjorie said, though she was not sure where this was going. "Then perhaps," Lady Catherine said, "it is time for you to use that knowledge in a different way. I have been thinking about this since you arrived here, watching you work. What if you were not the one doing the washing, but the one managing those who do? What if you trained others, supervised the quality of the work, managed the linens for the manor household?" Marjorie stared at her. "I do not know how to manage people," she said. "I have worked alone my whole life." "And yet you have managed your own business for 24 years, Lady Catherine said. "You have kept clients satisfied. You have maintained standards. You have built a reputation for quality. Those are the skills of management, Marjorie. You simply did not think of them that way." "The village women," Marjorie began. "The village women will still come to you if you wish them to," Lady Catherine said. "But I am asking you this. Would you be willing to come here to the manor 3 days a week? Would you be willing to oversee the washing of the household linens, to train the servants who do the actual washing, to ensure that the work is done to your standards? I would pay you well. More than you made as a washerwoman." It was a moment that felt like a crossroads, though Marjorie did not realize it at the time. It was a moment in which her life could have gone one way or another, in which she could have said no and attempted to return to the river work, damaging her hand further, probably, working in pain until something broke irreparably. Or she could have said yes. She said yes. The winter approaches again. The winter of 1344 came early, as if the previous winter had not been enough and the world wanted to try again. But it was different for Marjorie now. She was no longer standing in the river in the depths of cold. She was in the manor house, in the laundry room, which was heated and as comfortable as any workspace could be. She was teaching 2 young servants, a girl named Rose who was perhaps 18, and a boy named Thomas who was 16, how to do the washing work properly. It was harder than she had expected, teaching. It required her to put into words things that she had learned so deeply that they had become almost instinctive. She had to explain why cold water was better than hot for certain stains, why the type of soap mattered, why some linens needed gentle handling and others could be worked more vigorously. She had to learn to see her own knowledge as knowledge, rather than as simply the way things were done. But Rose was a quick learner, eager to please, and Thomas, while slower to understand, was strong and willing to work hard. By December, they were producing work that was acceptable, if not yet excellent. By January, it was nearly as good as the work Marjorie had done herself. She still did work for the village women, though now it was different. She would go to the river one day a week, on whatever day was the warmest and least icy, and she would do the washing herself. But there was less of it now. Some of the women had found other solutions, had learned to manage more of their own work or had hired servants. And some, the kindest ones, continued to bring their fine linens to Marjorie, even though they had to wait longer now to have them returned. Anne, the merchant's wife, was one of these. She came to the manor one afternoon in late January, carrying a bundle of fine linens and also carrying news. Alina's baby came, Anne said without preamble. "Listen, she is well and the boy is healthy. She asked me to tell you, since I would be seeing you." Alina, the girl who had come to Marjorie's door on that winter night months ago, who had thanked her for her discretion, who had written a letter from York. Alina was a mother now. Alina was well. Marjorie felt something in her chest ease, a tension that she had been carrying since the winter without quite realizing it was there. "That is good news," Marjorie said. "I am glad." She also said, and continued, that she has named the boy after his grandfather, her father. But his second name is Marjorie. Marjorie Alina's choice to honor you. "That is not necessary," Marjorie said automatically. "No," Anne agreed. "But it is done anyway. You saved her life, Marjorie, or at least you were part of saving her life. Women do not forget that. We tell stories about it quietly to our daughters and our friends. You are part of why we trust each other, why we are able to survive in a world that is not particularly kind to women. You should know that." The spring comes. Spring came again as it always did. The snow melted, the river warmed. The world emerged from its frozen state and began to remember what color was, what green was, what warmth felt like. Marjorie was now 29 years old in the working life of her hands, but she was 32 years old in her body. She had never married. She had never had children. She had never loved a man in a romantic way, though she had loved many things in her life. The particular quality of spring light after a hard winter, the feel of clean linen drying in the sun, the faces of the women she had worked for over the years as they aged and changed. She had been in love with work, perhaps, the way some people are in love with other people. But now the work has changed. Her hands had failed her in the way all hands fail eventually, and she had been forced to find a new way to be in the world. It was not the way she had imagined her life going. But it was not, she found, a worse way. She stood at the manor house one April morning in the laundry room that was now her domain, watching Rose and Thomas work. Rose was humming as she scrubbed a particularly stubborn stain. Thomas was wringing out a set of fine linens with the kind of careful attention that Marjorie had taught him. The linens were clean. The work was good. "That is well done," Marjorie said. "Both of you. The linens are clean, and they are not damaged. You have learned the work." Rose looked up, pleased. Thomas nodded, concentrating still on the task at hand. "When you are both older," Marjorie said, "when you have done this work long enough, you will understand it not just with your hands but with something deeper. You will be able to feel when a linen is truly clean, to know by instinct what treatment each stain requires. That is when you will be truly skilled." "How long does that take?" Rose asked. Marjorie considered the question. "For me, it took 24 years, she said. "But you may be faster. You may have better teachers." She held out her hands, showing them the scars, the slight misshapen quality of her left hand. "This is what the work does to you, eventually. The cold, the repeated strain, the damage that accumulates over decades. You should know that, and should understand it, before you decide whether this is the work you want to do for your life." "I like the work," Rose said simply. "I am good at it. I would rather do work I am good at than worry about what it costs me." It was a young person's answer, full of confidence that the future would be kind, that damage would not accumulate, that strength would hold. But it was also honest, and Marjorie respected that. "Then you will do well," Marjorie said. The years after. The story does not end here, though this feels like a natural resting point, like a place where Marjorie might finally be allowed to sleep. But life did not end here for Marjorie. She continued to work at the manor house for another 12 years. She trained not just Rose and Thomas, but many other servants in the art of washing fine linens. Some of them became skilled. Some of them moved on to other work. But the ones who stayed learned from her, and they learned well. Her left hand never fully recovered. It remained weak for the rest of her life, marked by the scars of the infection and the later damage from overuse. But her right hand remained strong, and she learned to do most of her work with one hand, which took her longer than it once had, but was still acceptable. She continued to work for the village women 1 day a week for several more years, though eventually this stopped, not because she was unable to do it, but because fewer women needed her services. The younger generation had different options. Some of them had servants. Some of them learned to do more of their own washing. The world was changing slowly, almost imperceptibly. Eleanor's son, who was named Edmund Marjorie Harrington, grew up to be a kind man, by all accounts, who remembered when his mother told him stories about the washerwoman who had kept her silence and done her work with grace. Whether he was kind because of those stories or would have been kind anyway, no one could say. But Eleanor told the story to anyone who would listen, and it mattered to her. Lady Catherine eventually retired to a smaller house on the manor grounds, and her daughter took over the running of the main household. The new lady was kinder than her mother, or at least kinder in different ways, and she continued Marjorie's position, recognizing that the work was good and that Marjorie was valuable to the household. When Marjorie finally stopped working, she was perhaps 60 by then, though she was never quite sure of her exact age. She did so gradually, moving from 3 days a week at the manor to 2, and then to 1, and then to consulting only, advising on particularly difficult problems. By the time she truly retired, Rose was the head of the laundry, and Thomas had married and moved to another village, where he did washing work of his own and taught his children the trade, and probably told them stories about the woman who had trained him. Marjorie lived in a small cottage on the manor grounds for the last years of her life, supported by the lady, and by the gratitude of the village women who had used her services for so many years. She was not wealthy, but she was not poor. She was not famous, but she was remembered. When she died, she was perhaps 70 years old on a cold day in December. The women of the village said that no one had ever seen anyone who could wash linens the way Marjorie could. They said that her hands had been her story, that everything she had lived through was written in the scars and the weakness and the remarkable strength that had brought her through winter after winter. They said that she had been kind and that kindness mattered. And then, as happens, they forgot her. New generations came. The village changed. The manor house changed hands. Eventually, it was destroyed in a fire, and the newer generations built something else on that ground. Elinor's son had children, and they had children, and somewhere in the family tree was the memory of a washerwoman, mentioned once in a letter, then forgotten again. But the work continued. Women continued to wash linens. They continued to do this difficult, necessary work, their hands growing older and damaged and scarred. And sometimes, when they were doing the work, when they were standing in cold water or dealing with a particularly stubborn stain, they would remember something that their mother or their grandmother had told them. They would remember that this work had value, that this work mattered, that even the most humble labor could be done with grace. Dear one, the fire has burned down to embers now. Marjorie's story has come to rest, the way all stories do eventually. She survived her winters. She did her work. She was kind to others, and kindness was returned to her. She did not become famous. She did not change the world, but she changed the lives of the people around her in small ways, in ways that mattered. This is what it means to be human, perhaps, to do the work that is given to you, to do it well, to be kind to others who are doing difficult work alongside you, to survive winter, to wait for spring, to know that your hands, no matter how damaged they become, are still capable of useful work, still capable of grace. Sleep well now, friend. The story is finished. The cold is past. Spring is coming as it always does, and Marjorie's hands, cracked and scarred and weak though they were, have finally come to rest. The continuation, the legacy of hands. But stories, dear friend, do not truly end when the storyteller stops speaking. They continue in the lives of those who heard them, in the hands that remember the work, in the wisdom that passes from one generation to the next like water flowing downhill, finding its way through cracks and channels, persisting long after the source has disappeared. So let me tell you what came after Marjorie's death. Let me tell you about the people who remembered her, who carried her story forward, who learned not just from what she taught with words, but from what she had written into the very fabric of the work itself. The daughter who never was. Rose, who had learned the washing trade from Marjorie, was perhaps the most direct inheritor of her knowledge. Rose had become, by the time Marjorie died, the head of the manor's laundry. She was a woman in her middle years. her hands beginning to show the same marks that Marjorie's hands had shown. The cracks, the slight swelling in the joints, the way the fingers curled slightly even when you wanted them to be straight. Rose had never married. She had never intended to marry. She had fallen in love with the work as Marjorie had fallen in love with it, and that love had been enough. She had a purpose. She had skills. She was respected for what she could do. When Marjorie died, Rose was the one who prepared her body for burial. It was not her official duty. That fell to the women of the village, to Alice who had helped Marjorie when she was ill, to the other women who had known her. But Rose came and asked to do it, and she was allowed. She washed Marjorie's body with water that was warm, a luxury that Marjorie had rarely allowed herself in life. She used the best soap, the soap that they reserved for the finest linens. She handled the body with the same care and attention that she had learned from Marjorie, the same respect for the material that came into her hands. And as she was washing, Rose noticed something that she had never fully appreciated before. Marjorie's hands were beautiful. Not in the way that the hands of a lady are beautiful, soft and unmarked and unused, but beautiful in the way that something is beautiful when it has been made for a purpose and has fulfilled that purpose completely. The hands were strong even in death. The fingers were clever. The scars told stories. Rose held one of those hands and she wept. She had never fully understood until that moment what it had cost Marjorie to teach her, to pass on the knowledge. She had never fully understood that Marjorie was not just teaching Rose a trade, but was teaching her a way of being in the world, a way of doing work that mattered, a way of maintaining standards even when no one was watching, a way of being kind to people who were struggling. At Marjorie's funeral, it was a small thing, held on a cold December morning in the churchyard. Rose stood and spoke. It was unusual for someone from her station to speak at a funeral. Usually it was the priest who spoke, and perhaps a family member. But the priest deferred to Rose, recognizing perhaps that she had a right to speak. Marjorie was the finest washerwoman I have ever known, Rose said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried in the cold air. She taught me not just how to wash linens, but how to take pride in work. She taught me that ordinary work done with care and attention is not ordinary at all. She taught me that your hands are how you speak to the world, and that what you create with your hands is a kind of language. She was kind. She was skilled. She was good. After the funeral, as people were walking back to the village, Aliner's son, who was now a man, perhaps 30 years old, with children of his own, came to find Rose. "My mother told me about Marjorie," he said. "She told me that Marjorie was the reason she survived. I wanted you to know that we remember. We will always remember." The servant's child. One of the people who heard Rose speak at Marjorie's funeral was a girl named Catherine, who was perhaps 12 years old. Catherine was the daughter of a servant who worked at the manor, a woman who had worked in the laundry under Marjorie's supervision. Catherine had sometimes come to the laundry with her mother, had watched the work being done, had even, on occasion, been allowed to help with the simplest tasks. Catherine had never thought much about the work until she heard Rose speak. But something in Rose's words caught her. Something about the idea that ordinary work could be extraordinary if you did it with care. It resonated with something in Catherine's young mind, some part of her that was looking for a way to matter, a way to be important in the world. Years later, when Catherine was a woman and her mother had retired from the laundry work, Catherine took her mother's place. She trained under Rose, and she learned the trade as Marjorie had learned it, as Rose had learned it. She learned that good work was not about speed but about attention. She learned that the smallest details mattered. She learned that your hands and your mind had to work together and had to be united in purpose. Catherine had children, 3 daughters and a son. She taught them the work when they were young, showing them how to treat different fabrics, how to approach different stains, and how to take care of their hands even as the work was damaging their hands. She told them stories about Marjorie, about the winter when Marjorie had nearly died of infection, about the way her hands had failed her, but she had found a way to continue anyway. "Your hands are your tools," Catherine would say to her children. "They are also your responsibility. You must take care of them, and you must not take them for granted. They are how you do your work in the world." Her oldest daughter, who was named Marjorie, after the famous Washerwoman, a name that had become common in the village over the generations, grew up to become skilled at laundry work herself. She took pride in it. She was known, eventually, as the finest washerwoman in a 3-village area. People sought her out specifically, paid extra for her work. "I learned from my mother, Catherine," Marjorie the younger would say when people complimented her work. And she learned from Rose, and Rose learned from the first Marjorie, the one they say nearly froze to death in the winter of 1343. That is 4 generations of knowledge in my hands. When you hire me to wash your linens, you are hearing not just me, but all of them. The merchant's daughter. Back in York, Eleanor had indeed borne a son, Edmund Marjorie Harrington, and as she had promised, she told him stories about the washerwoman who had helped her. But Eleanor also had a daughter, born 3 years after Edmund, whom she named Margaret after Marjorie and after her own mother. Margaret Harrington grew up in a household of relative wealth and ease. She had servants. She did not have to do any of the manual work that Marjorie had done. But her mother, who was perhaps more thoughtful than many women of her station, made sure that Margaret understood the value of work, understood that the linens that came to her soft and clean had required someone's labor, someone's pain, someone's dedication. When Margaret was 16, her mother arranged for her to spend a summer with the family of one of Eleanor's friends, a family that lived in a smaller town and did not have as many servants. For that summer, Margaret helped with the household work, including the washing. She stood in cold water. It was summer, so the water was not as cold as it would have been in winter, but still cold, and she washed linens with her own hands. She felt her hands grow rough. She felt the ache in her back and shoulders. She felt, for the first time, what Marjorie had felt every day for 24 years. When she returned to York, she was changed. She spoke to her mother about what she had learned. She asked for details about Marjorie, about what had happened to her, about how she had survived. Eleanor, now aging, was happy to tell the full story. The infection, the fever, the way her hand had failed her, the way she had found a new path. Eleanor also told her about the kindness that had saved Marjorie's life, and about the importance of extending that kindness to others. Margaret never became a washerwoman herself. That was not her path, but she became a different kind of person because of what she had learned. She became someone who understood the value of labor, who paid servants fairly, who treated them with respect. She became someone who listened to stories and passed them on. When she had children of her own, 2 daughters and a son, she told them about their ancestor, the washerwoman who had survived winter and done her work with grace. "In our family," she would say, "we do not forget the people who did the real work that allowed us to live the lives we live. We remember Marjorie, we honor her, and we try, in our own ways, to live with the same dignity and care that she brought to everything she did." The slow forgetting and the sudden remembering. The decades passed, 100 years. The village of Ashford changed slowly, the way villages do. The manor house burned and was rebuilt. Wars came and went. Plagues swept through and took people. The river still ran cold in winter and warm in summer. Life continued, as it always did, with small dramas and large catastrophes, births and deaths, seasons turning endlessly into each other. Marjorie's name faded from common memory. There was no monument to her. There was no official record of her life beyond the vague references in the household accounts of the manor house, payments for laundry work, payments for her service as head of the laundry, finally a small pension in her last years. If you were to look in the churchyard, you would find her grave marked with a simple stone, like many other stones, with a name that was no longer quite readable, worn smooth by 2 centuries of weather. But in the families that had known her, or that had known people who had known her, the memory persisted. The story was told differently each time, sometimes accurate, sometimes changed by the needs of the teller. But the essential elements remained. A woman who worked with her hands, who survived hardship, who was kind, who did her work with care. In the 17th century, nearly 300 years after Marjorie's death, a woman named Elizabeth was doing laundry work in a village not far from Ashford. Elizabeth had learned the trade from her mother, who had learned it from her mother's mother, stretching back through generations. She was skilled and respected, and one day a scholar came to the village, a man who was traveling and collecting stories about the ordinary people of England, trying to understand how they had lived, what their daily life had been like. Elizabeth was washing linens when the scholar found her, standing in a river much like the river where Marjorie had worked, doing work much like the work Marjorie had done. The scholar asked her about her work, about how long she had been doing it, about what it had cost her. And Elizabeth, as she worked, told him stories. She told him about women who had come before her, about her mother and her grandmother. And at some point in the telling, she mentioned Marjorie. "There was a washerwoman," Elizabeth said, "who lived perhaps 300 years ago in a village called Ashford. My great-great-grandmother knew her, or knew someone who knew her. She survived a terrible winter, It was very cold, and she nearly died of an infection in her hand. But she lived, and she continued to do her work, and she was kind to people. My great-great-grandmother said that Marjorie taught people that ordinary work, done with care, was sacred work. That is why I do this work the way I do it. Because Marjorie did it that way, and my ancestors learned from her, and I learned from them. The scholar wrote this down. He included it in a collection of stories about ordinary people that he eventually published. It was not a famous book. It did not circulate widely. But it existed. And in that book, written in a scholar's careful hand, Marjorie's name was preserved. The story of her winter, her hands, her work was recorded. The modern discovery. Skip forward now, if you will, to the present day. A university student named James was doing research on medieval work practices, on the history of labor and class in medieval England. He was looking for primary sources, for accounts written by people who had actually lived through those times. He was searching through digitized old texts, through collections that had been preserved and made available to researchers. And he found a passage in a book by a scholar from the 17th century, a man who had collected stories about ordinary people. The passage described a washerwoman named Marjorie who had lived in a place called Ashford in the 14th century, who had survived a terrible winter and an infection, who had been known for her skill and her kindness. James was struck by this passage. He did not know why at first. It was just a few sentences, just one story among many. But something about it caught him. Perhaps it was because it was so specific, the dates, the place, the details about the work. Perhaps it was because in all his research about medieval labor, he had rarely encountered an account that focused so much on a single person, on their experience, on what their work had meant to them. He began to research further. He found the household accounts from the manor house at Ashford that mentioned payments for laundry work. He found references to Marjorie in documents that had been preserved. He found, in a church record, a note about the burial of a woman named Marjorie Thorne in 1374. He found, in a later document, a reference to Eleanor Harrington writing a letter that mentioned her gratitude to Marjorie. Slowly, painstakingly, James pieced together the story. He could not know everything. Some things were lost to time. Some things had been forgotten. Some things had been changed in the telling. But he knew enough. He could know that Marjorie had been a real person, that she had lived, that she had done important work, that people had cared about her and had remembered her. James wrote a paper about Marjorie. It was published in a small academic journal devoted to the history of medieval labor. The paper was not widely read, but it was read by some people. Some scholars, some students, some people were interested in the lives of ordinary people, in the work that had made civilization possible, in the hands that had built the world we live in. One person who read the paper was a woman named Sarah, who was a documentary filmmaker. Sarah read James's paper and became fascinated by the story of Marjorie. She contacted James. They began to work together to create a documentary about medieval washerwomen, using Marjorie's story as the central thread. The documentary was shown at film festivals. It won awards. It was eventually broadcast on television, and millions of people watched it. They watched reconstructions of Marjorie standing in the river in winter, her hands in freezing water. They watched Sarah, the filmmaker, interview historians and scholars about what life would have been like for a woman in Marjorie's position. They watched modern washerwomen demonstrate techniques that had been passed down through centuries, techniques that had originated with women like Marjorie. The documentary changed nothing. The world continued as it had. People still did not think much about the work that went into their clean clothes. But for a moment, for the duration of the film, millions of people had to confront the reality of Marjorie's life, had to imagine what it would be like to spend decades doing difficult, necessary work, had to recognize that the comfort of their lives had been built on the labor of people like her. The letter from the future. After the documentary aired, Sarah received letters from people who had watched it. Most of them were brief, expressing appreciation for the film. But one letter stood out. It came from a woman named Eleanor, who was in her 80s and lived in a small village in Yorkshire, not far from Ashford, as it turned out. Eleanor wrote, "I watched your documentary about Marjorie Thorne and I wept. My family has a story about Marjorie, a story that has been passed down through our family for 600 years. My ancestor Eleanor was helped by Marjorie when she was in trouble, and my family has never forgotten. Every generation of my family has known the story of Marjorie's kindness. When my children were born, I told them about Marjorie, and I have told my grandchildren. Now I am old, and I wanted someone to know that Marjorie's story has survived. It has survived in my family. It has survived in the memory of women who knew women who knew women who knew her. And now it has survived in your film, and it will survive for new generations who did not know anything about Marjorie until they watched your documentary." Eleanor went on to explain that her family had preserved some documents, old letters, family records, that contained additional details about Marjorie. She offered to share these with Sarah, to help create an even more complete picture of who Marjorie had been. Sarah traveled to Yorkshire to meet Eleanor in person. They sat together in Eleanor's small cottage, drinking tea, and Eleanor showed Sarah letters and documents that had been kept for centuries. There were fragments of Eleanor's own writings, the one who had been Marjorie's patron, who had been so grateful for her help. There were references to Marjorie in various family documents. There was a letter from Eleanor's daughter, written 100 years after Marjorie's death, mentioning the washerwoman Marjorie, whom our mother loved and whom we honor. Sarah wept as she looked at these documents. She felt the presence of all the people who had kept this story alive, all the people who had cared enough to remember, to pass it on, to ensure that Marjorie would not be completely forgotten. The second documentary. Sarah decided to make another film. This one would focus not just on Marjorie herself, but on the way that Marjorie's story had survived, on the way that memory had been preserved in families, on the power of ordinary people to keep stories alive across centuries. The second documentary included interviews with Alina and her family members. It included the documents they had preserved. It included scholars discussing how memory works, how stories change and are preserved, how the lives of ordinary people can matter even after they are gone. It also included interviews with modern washerwomen, people who still did laundry work by hand, who had learned from mothers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers. Some of these women traced their knowledge back to Marjorie, at least in spirit if not in an unbroken line. Others simply knew that they were part of a long tradition of women doing this work, and they wanted to honor that tradition. One of the people interviewed was a woman named Rose, a descendant of the original Rose, though several generations removed, who was in her 70s and still did laundry work occasionally, although she had retired from doing it full-time. Rose spoke about what the work meant to her, about what it had taught her about discipline and care, and the importance of doing things well even when no one was paying close attention. "Marjorie teaches us," Rose said, "that your work is your legacy, that the things you create with your hands, the care you put into them matters. It matters because it makes people's lives better. It matters because it is honest work. And it matters because it connects you to all the people who came before you, who did this work, who learned and taught and passed on their knowledge." The finding of the grave. During the filming of the second documentary, a researcher was searching through church records in Ashford, trying to find more information about Marjorie. She discovered that Marjorie's grave was still there, in the churchyard, marked with a stone that had become nearly illegible over the centuries. The stone had been worn smooth by weather and by the passage of hundreds of feet over hundreds of years. The researcher contacted the church, and they agreed to restore the gravestone. A stonemason was brought in, and the inscription was carefully traced and recarved. It read, "Marjorie Thorne, Washerwoman, 1313-1374. She did her work with grace." No one knew if that last phrase had been on the original stone. The church records did not specify, but it seemed fitting, seemed like the right epitaph for Marjorie, seemed like what people would have said about her. When the stone was restored, there was a small ceremony. Alina and her family came. Sarah and her documentary crew came. Scholars and historians came. People from the village came. And they stood around Marjorie's grave, a grave that had been largely forgotten, that had been just one of hundreds of graves in the churchyard, and they acknowledged her. They spoke her name. They honored her memory. One of Alina's great-grandchildren, a boy of perhaps 12 years old, stood at the grave and said, "Marjorie, we remember you. We know what you did. We know that you were strong and kind and that you did important work. We will tell people about you. We will remember." And in that moment, for those people gathered at the grave, Marjorie was not forgotten. She was present. She was real. She had lived and she had mattered, and people cared enough to remember. The continuation of work. The documentary series. There ended up being 3 films, a trilogy about Marjorie and the work that she did, and the legacy of that work became more widely known. They were shown in schools. They were discussed in universities. They were shared on social media. where clips of modern women doing laundry work went viral, where people expressed amazement at the strength and skill required, where Marjorie's name began to be known to people far beyond the small village where she had lived. And something unexpected happened. People began to think differently about labor. They began to notice the hands of the people who did necessary work: cleaners, laundry workers, dishwashers, gardeners, all the people whose work made civilization possible but who were often invisible. They began to ask about these people's lives, their stories, their struggles and triumphs. Scholars began to research more about medieval washerwomen and other laboring women, trying to understand their lives and their work. Artists began to create art about Marjorie and about the women who came after her. Musicians wrote songs. Writers wrote stories. Marjorie's story became part of the culture, part of how people understood the past, part of how people thought about work and class and gender. But more importantly, in small, quiet ways, Marjorie's story affected individual people. A woman who worked as a house cleaner watched the documentary and saw herself in Marjorie. She saw that her work mattered, that it was work done with skill and care, that it was honorable. She began to approach her work differently, with more intentionality, with more pride. She began to teach her daughter about the work, the way she had never taught her before, because she had never understood that it was worthy of teaching. A student who was struggling in school watched the documentary and was struck by Marjorie's determination to continue working even when her body was failing. The student applied that lesson to her own struggles, decided not to give up, worked harder, and eventually graduated and went to university. Years later, she wrote a book about medieval women, and Marjorie was one of the central figures in the book. A young man who was training to be a mason watched the documentary and thought about the hands of the people who built things, about the way that work shaped the world and shaped the people who did the work. He began to be more careful in his work, more thoughtful, more intentional. He began to teach apprentices not just the technical skills of masonry, but also the philosophy of craft, the idea that your work is a form of communication, a way of saying something about who you are and what you believe. All of these were small ripples, not large waves. The world did not change dramatically. People still did not always respect labor. People still often did not think about the hands that made their lives comfortable. But something shifted slightly in the way that people thought about work, about the people who did necessary labor, about the importance of care and skill and attention. The return to the river. Now let me tell you about one more thing. Let me tell you about what happened when Sarah, the documentary filmmaker, went back to the river where Marjorie had worked. It was spring when she went, a time when the snow had melted and the river was running high and clear. The village of Ashford had changed in many ways, but the river was still there, still running from the limestone hills to the north, still flowing toward the south where it joined larger rivers on their way to the sea. Sarah stood at the spot where Marjorie had stood for so many years, where she had washed linens in cold water, where her hands had grown cracked and scarred, where she had done work that was necessary and difficult and often unnoticed. And Sarah thought about all the hands that had worked in this river. Marjorie's hands, Rose's hands, Catherine's hands. All the hands of all the women who had stood in this water, who had done this work, who had passed on the knowledge and the skill and the understanding of why the work mattered. She thought about how those hands had shaped the world, not through grand gestures or famous deeds, but through the simple, constant work of maintaining, of caring for, of ensuring that the things people needed were clean and whole and available to them. Sarah knelt by the river and put her hands in the water. It was cold, even in spring it was cold, and she understood in that moment what Marjorie had endured. She understood the shock of that cold, the way it made your breath catch, the way it made your hands numb and then burning as they warmed. She understood what it meant to do this work not for a day or a week, but for decades. She pulled her hands out of the water and held them up in the spring sunlight. They were unmarked, smooth, unused to labor. But they were hands that had learned to tell stories, hands that had learned to create films that carried stories to thousands of people. They were different from Marjorie's hands, but they were doing work that was, in some way, related. They were both hands that were trying to make the world better, trying to help people understand each other, trying to preserve what was worth preserving. Sarah sat by the river for a long time, just sitting, just being present to the place where Marjorie had spent so much of her life. And she felt connected, across the centuries, to all the women who had stood in this water, who had done this work, who had somehow managed to continue even when their bodies were failing them, even when the world did not particularly value what they were doing. When she finally stood up to leave, Sarah made a silent promise to Marjorie and to all the other washerwomen. She promised that she would continue to tell their stories, that she would ensure that they were not forgotten, that she would help people understand what their lives had been like and why it mattered. And she left a small stone by the river, a stone carved with Marjorie's name, a tiny monument in a place where no monument had existed before. It was a small thing, a gesture that would eventually be washed away by the river or covered by silt or simply disappear into the landscape. But it was a marker, a sign that someone had been there, that someone had done important work, that someone had mattered. The continuation forward. Dear friend, the story does not end here either, though we are reaching a natural resting point. A place where the narrative begins to feel complete, where Marjorie's life and legacy have been honored and preserved in multiple ways. But the truth is that the story continues. It continues every time someone does work with care and attention, even when no one is watching. It continues every time someone chooses to be kind, even when kindness is not required. It continues every time someone tells a story about an ordinary person, helping to keep them alive in memory and in the culture. Marjorie's story is not unique. There were thousands of Marjories in the medieval world, thousands of women who did difficult, necessary work, who were skilled at their craft, who were kind to others, whose hands shaped the world even though their names were forgotten. But because Marjorie's story was preserved, through Eleanor's gratitude, through Rose's teaching, through Catherine's memory, through the scholars' collection, through Sarah's documentary, she has become, in a sense, representative. She has become the story we tell about all those women, the way we acknowledge and honor their labor. And that, perhaps, is the greatest legacy of all. Not that Marjorie was famous or powerful or wealthy, but that she mattered enough to be remembered, that her work was valued enough to be passed on, that her life was worthy of being told. So when you wash your hands, when you do work that is necessary and humble and often unnoticed, remember Marjorie. Remember that your hands are your statement to the world, that what you create with them matters, that the care you put into your work is a form of love. Remember that you are part of a long line of people stretching backward through time, all of them doing the work that had to be done, all of them trying to do it as well as they could. And if you ever find yourself standing in cold water on a winter day, doing work that is difficult and maybe not appreciated, remember Marjorie Thorne. Remember that she survived. Remember that she continued. Remember that she was kind. Remember that her hands, cracked and scarred and weak though they were, did important work that has echoed forward through the centuries to reach us now. The fire has burned down to nothing now, dear one. The embers are gray and cold, but the story remains, warm in the heart, persistent, refusing to be forgotten. Sleep now and carry Marjorie with you into your dreams. Carry her hands and the work they did and the grace with which she did it. Sleep well. The winter is over. Spring is coming, and the river continues to flow as it always has, as it always will. The third winter, what came after? But sleep, as we know, does not last forever. Morning comes, whether we are ready for it or not. And with morning comes the realization that stories, like life itself, do not follow neat and tidy paths. They spiral backward and forward. They tangle with other stories. They continue in ways we do not expect. So let me tell you what happened in the years after Sarah's documentary was released, after Marjorie's name had become known to thousands of people, after the river where she worked had become, in a small way, a place of pilgrimage. The descendant who did not know. In a city several hundred miles from Ashford, in a modern apartment with central heating and running water, a woman named Julia was watching the documentary series. Julia was 28 years old, a successful lawyer, someone who had escaped what she thought of as the trap of her background, a working-class family, a mother who had done cleaning work, a grandmother who had done laundry work, a great-grandmother whose work was lost to time. Julia had worked hard to distance herself from all of that. She had gone to university. She had become a lawyer. She earned good money. She lived in a nice apartment. She did not do manual labor. She did not work with her hands in ways that left them damaged or scarred. She watched the documentary almost by accident. It came up in her social media feed, and she clicked on it out of idle curiosity. She did not expect it to affect her. She expected to watch it with a kind of detached interest, the way you might watch a historical film about people from a distant past who had nothing to do with you. But something about Marjorie's story caught her. Perhaps it was the detail about Marjorie's hands, the way the documentary showed the scars and the damage. Perhaps it was the way that Marjorie was portrayed, not as a victim of circumstance, but as a capable, skilled woman who had made a choice to do her work well even when it was difficult. Perhaps it was something else, something that Julia could not quite articulate. Whatever it was, Julia found herself crying by the end of the first film. She was crying about a medieval washerwoman, about a woman who had lived 700 years ago, about a woman whose life was so different from her own that they seemed to have nothing in common. That night, Julia called her mother. She had not called her mother in several months. Their relationship was strained. Julia's mother had never understood why Julia wanted to leave the family's working-class world, why she was so determined to become someone different, to live a different kind of life. Julia's mother had always worked hard, first as a cleaner, then as a housekeeper for a wealthy family, and she had always been proud of her work. She had wanted Julia to be proud of her heritage, to understand the value of honest labor. But Julia had rejected all of that. She had wanted to be more, to do more, to be something other than what her family was. "Hi, Mom," Julia said when her mother answered. "I just watched something that made me think of you. A documentary about medieval washerwomen." "Medieval washerwomen," her mother said, sounding confused. "Why would you watch something like that?" "There's this woman named Marjorie," Julia said. "She was a washerwoman in England in the 1400s. And she was really skilled. And she did her work with care, even though it was hard work, even though it damaged her hands. And people remembered her. People honored her work." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Julia's mother said, quietly, "Your grandmother did that kind of work. Did you know that? She did laundry work by hand for most of her life. She never talked about it much, but I remember her hands. They were beautiful in their way. Marked but strong." Julia began to cry again. "I never really understood," she said. "I never understood that the work was important. I thought I had to escape it, that if I didn't escape it, I would be stuck in it." "You did escape it," her mother said, and there was no anger in her voice, just sadness. "You got out. You became a lawyer. You have a nice life. That's what I wanted for you. But you didn't have to reject where you came from to do it. You didn't have to pretend that the work your grandmother did was somehow shameful." Julia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry for acting like I was better than you, better than the work you do. I wasn't better. I was just different. And I was wrong to act like different was better." After they hung up, Julia sat in her apartment and thought about her grandmother, whom she had barely known. Her grandmother had died when Julia was young, and Julia's mother had not talked much about her. But now Julia tried to imagine her, standing in cold water, washing clothes by hand, her hands growing marked and scarred by years of work. Julia tried to imagine what that would have been like, what that would have cost. She thought about Marjorie and she thought about her grandmother, and she realized that they were connected across the centuries by the same work, the same kind of hands, the same kind of care and dedication. The next day, Julia took a day off work and visited her mother. Her mother lived in a small house in a working-class neighborhood, the house that Julia had grown up in. Julia had not been there in more than a year. Her mother was surprised to see her. They sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen where Julia had sat as a child, and Julia's mother made tea the way she always did, with care and attention, warming the pot first, using loose tea instead of bags, arranging the cups and the milk and the sugar on a small tray. "I want to know about Grandma," Julia said. "About her work. About what it was like. I want to know the stories." Her mother smiled, and it was a sad smile, but also a relieved smile, as if she had been waiting a long time for this question. "Her name was Margaret," Julia's mother said. "She was called Maggie. She came from a village in Yorkshire, a small place called Ashford. She did laundry work there for most of her life, and then she moved to the city when she was older, and she did housekeeping work. She was very skilled. People requested her specifically. They trusted her with their finest things." "Do you think she was happy?" Julia asked. "I don't know if happy is the right word," her mother said. "But I think she was satisfied. I think she was proud of her work. I think she knew that what she did mattered. And I think she wanted me to know that too, even though I ended up doing similar work to hers. She wanted me to take pride in it." "And did you?" Julia asked. "Do you?" "I'm trying to," her mother said. "It's not always easy. When you grow up doing this work, when you see how hard it is, how much it costs you, you want something different for your children. You want them to have an easier life. But I think I made a mistake. I think I communicated to you that the work was something to be ashamed of, something to escape from. I didn't mean to do that. I was just trying to help you have a better life." Julia reached across the table and took her mother's hand. It was a hand that showed the marks of years of work, calluses, slight swelling in the joints, small scars. It was a hand that was still strong, still capable, still beautiful in the way that Marjorie's hands had been beautiful. "I think I want to learn about this," Julia said. "I want to understand the work my grandmother did, the work you do. I want to understand it in a way I never did before. Not so I can do it myself necessarily, but so I can honor it. So I can understand where I come from." "That would make me happy," her mother said. "That would make me very happy." The documentation of craft. Over the next few months, Julia began to spend more time with her mother. She asked her mother to teach her about the work, how to do laundry properly, how to treat different fabrics, how to approach different stains. Her mother taught her patiently, showing her how to use cold water, how to apply soap, and how to scrub without damaging the material. At first, Julia's hands hurt. The work was harder than she had expected. Her fingers became raw, her wrists ached. She understood for the first time what the physical toll of this work was, but she persisted, and as she worked, side by side with her mother, she began to understand something else. She began to understand that this work had a kind of meditation to it, a kind of peace. You could think while you were doing it, or you could let your mind go quiet. The work was something that your hands could do while your mind wandered or rested. It was, in its own way, restorative. Julia began to think about this in a new way. She began to see the work not as something to escape from, but as something that had value in itself, that had a kind of wisdom embedded in it. She decided to write about it. She was a lawyer, but she was also a good writer. She had to be, to write legal briefs and arguments. She began to write about her mother's work, about her grandmother's work, about what she had learned from watching the documentary about Marjorie. She called her project Hands, a legal and social history of women's labor. She wrote about medieval washerwomen like Marjorie, about the legal status of women workers, about the way that labor was valued or devalued based on who was doing it. She wrote about her own family's history, about her grandmother and her mother. She wrote about what she had learned from actually doing the work herself, about what it meant to understand labor not just intellectually but physically, in your own hands and body. The writing was good. It was personal and scholarly at the same time. It was honest and thoughtful. She submitted it to a journal devoted to labor history and gender studies. They accepted it. The article was published, and slowly people began to read it. Other scholars cited her work. She was invited to speak at conferences about medieval women's labor and modern class issues. Someone asked her to write a book expanding on her article. Julia found herself, somewhat to her surprise, becoming an expert on the history of women's labor, on the cultural and social significance of ordinary work. But more importantly, Julia found that she had healed something in herself, something that had been broken when she decided that she had to escape her background to be valuable. She found that she could honor her family's history while also living her own life. She could be a lawyer and also understand the work her grandmother and mother did. She could be proud of her own accomplishments and also proud of theirs. The unexpected connection. About 2 years after Julia published her first article, she received an email from Sarah, the documentary filmmaker. Sarah had read Julia's work and was struck by the connection between Julia's research and Marjorie's story. Sarah wanted to interview Julia for a possible fourth documentary in the series, one that would focus on how Marjorie's story had affected people in the modern world, how it had changed the way people thought about labor and class and family history. Julia agreed, and Sarah traveled to meet her. They spent several days together, Julia showing Sarah her research, introducing her to her mother, talking about what had changed in Julia's life since she had watched the documentary. On the last day that Sarah was there, Julia's mother made tea for them, and they sat in the kitchen where Julia had grown up. Sarah recorded the conversation, with Julia's mother's permission, and she asked Julia's mother about her own mother, about what she remembered about her mother's hands. "My mother's hands were beautiful," Julia's mother said. "People don't usually think of hands like hers, marked by work, scarred, the joints swollen, as beautiful. But they were. They were beautiful because they told the story of a life of dedication, of care, of skill. When I look at my own hands now, I see my mother's hands in them. And I see my grandmother's hands. And I think if I look carefully enough, I probably see Marjorie's hands too, in a metaphorical sense at least." Sarah was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Do you know that's probably literally true? The work you do, the techniques you use, they have probably descended in some way from medieval washerwomen. The knowledge of how to treat different fabrics, how to approach different stains, how to take care of your hands while doing the work, all of that has been passed down through generations of women. So in a way, you are doing Marjorie's work. You are continuing what she started. Julia's mother looked down at her hands, turning them over, examining them. "I never thought of it that way," she said. "I never thought of myself as connected to someone like Marjorie, someone from hundreds of years ago. But I suppose I am. We are all connected, all the women who have done this work. We are all part of the same tradition." Sarah filmed all of this. She filmed Julia's mother's hands. She filmed the kitchen where the conversation was taking place. She filmed Julia looking at her mother's hands and then looking down at her own hands, as if seeing them for the first time. That footage became the center of the fourth documentary. Sarah called it "The Hands That Remember: Marjorie's Legacy Through Time." The film traced the work of washing linens from medieval times to the present day, showing how the work had changed and also how it had stayed the same. But more importantly, it showed how the knowledge and the care and the dedication of medieval washerwomen like Marjorie had been passed down through generations, had shaped the way that modern women approached their work, and had created a kind of lineage of care and skill. The documentary was even more successful than the previous three. It was shown at more film festivals. It won more awards. It was broadcast on major television networks, and people responded to it powerfully. People watched it and thought about their own families' histories, about the work their parents or grandparents had done, about the ways that they were connected to people from the past through labor and through care. The Pilgrimage. In the spring after the fourth documentary was released, Sarah organized what she called the Marjorie Project, a pilgrimage to Ashford. She invited Julia and Julia's mother and Alina, who was now in her 90s and rarely traveled, and the modern descendants of other people mentioned in the story, and anyone else who wanted to come: scholars, filmmakers, washerwomen, people who had been affected by Marjorie's story. About 50 people made the pilgrimage. They traveled to the village of Ashford, to the church where Marjorie was buried, to the river where she had worked. It was spring, and the river was running high and clear. The willows were just beginning to show their leaves. The air was soft and warm, carrying the promise of summer. The group stood by the river, and Sarah spoke about Marjorie, about what she had done, about why her story mattered. Then Julia spoke about what she had learned from Marjorie, about how the documentary had changed her understanding of her own family's history. Then Julia's mother spoke, and she spoke about her hands, about the hands of her mother and her grandmother, about the way that work was passed down through women. Alina, who was very old now and who spoke in a quiet voice that people had to strain to hear, spoke last. She said, "My ancestor Alina was helped by Marjorie Thorne. That kindness saved her life, and that kindness has echoed forward through my family for nearly 700 years. We have never forgotten. And we have tried to live in a way that honored what Marjorie did. We have tried to be kind to people who were struggling. We have tried to remember that grace matters, that it is real, that it makes a difference." After Alina finished speaking, there was a long silence. People stood by the river, quiet, just being present to the place where Marjorie had spent so much of her life. Then, one by one, people began to put their hands in the river. They waded into the cold water, and they stood there, letting the water flow over their hands. Some of them were washerwomen, their hands marked by the work. Some of them were lawyers or teachers or artists or other kinds of workers, their hands unmarked but capable. Some of them were old and some were young. But all of them, standing in the river in the place where Marjorie had stood, were connected. Julia stood in the water and thought about her grandmother, about the hands she barely remembered but now understood. She thought about how those hands had helped to shape her life, had helped to create the circumstances that allowed Julia to be a lawyer, to be educated, to have choices. She thought about how she owed a debt to those hands, even though her grandmother was long dead. When the group left the river and moved to the churchyard, where Marjorie's gravestone had been restored, there was another ceremony. Someone had brought flowers and they placed flowers around the grave. Someone else had brought a stone, a smooth river stone, and left it on the gravestone, a marker, a sign of presence. Alina placed a letter on the gravestone. It was a letter addressed to Marjorie, written by Alina's ancestor, the original Alina, nearly 700 years ago. It had been preserved in the family documents, and Alina had decided that it should return to Ashford, should return to the place where Marjorie had lived. The letter was short. It said simply, "Dear Marjorie, I owe you my life and my peace of mind. I will never forget your kindness. I will teach my children to remember you. You will live on in our family's memory and in our gratitude. May you rest in peace." The photograph. Sarah took a photograph at Marjorie's grave. It shows a group of people standing around a gravestone in an old churchyard in spring, with flowers blooming. It shows the restored stone, with Marjorie's name clearly visible. It shows Julia's mother with her arm around Julia, and Alina sitting on a bench nearby, looking peaceful. It shows diverse faces, different ages, different kinds of people, all gathered in honor of a woman who had lived 700 years before any of them were born. That photograph was used on the cover of a book, a collection of essays about Marjorie's story and its impact. The book included Sarah's documentary scripts. It included Julia's research. It included essays by scholars about medieval labor and gender. It included interviews with modern washerwomen. It included Alina's family documents. It included photographs and drawings and reconstructions of what medieval Ashford might have looked like. The book was published and became more widely known than any of the films. It was assigned in university classes. It was read by historians and by ordinary people interested in history. It was translated into multiple languages. Marjorie's story began to spread far beyond Yorkshire, far beyond England, across the world. And everywhere that the story spread, it had an effect on people. It made them think about labor differently. It made them think about the women and men who did necessary work, who often went unnoticed and unappreciated. It made them think about their own families' histories, about the work their ancestors had done. It made them think about care, the care that goes into doing work well, the care that matters even when no one is watching. The museum. 10 years after Sarah first made her documentary, a museum opened in a building near Ashford. It was called the Marjorie Thorne Museum of Medieval Labor and Community Life. It had exhibits about medieval washing practices, about the history of laundry work, about the lives of medieval women. It had a reproduction of a medieval laundry room with authentic materials and tools. It had a room dedicated to Marjorie specifically, with documents related to her life, with artistic renderings of what she might have looked like, with recordings of modern washerwomen talking about their work. One entire wing of the museum was dedicated to the documentary films and to the impact that Marjorie's story had had on contemporary culture. There were displays showing reviews and essays about the films. There were photographs of the pilgrimage to Ashford. There was a whole section about Julia's research and about how Marjorie's story had caused people to reconsider their own family histories. The museum became a tourist attraction. Thousands of people visit each year. They walked through the exhibits. They stood in the reproduction medieval laundry room. They watched clips from the documentaries. They read about Marjorie's life. And many of them have changed. Many of them went home and called their parents or their grandparents and asked about their family's history, about the work that had been done to make their lives possible. Many of them began to think differently about the people who did necessary labor. Many of them began to see those people not as background characters in their own lives, but as real people with real skills and real knowledge and real value. The letter to Marjorie. One day, about 15 years after Sarah had made the first documentary, a young woman named Kate came to the museum. Kate was in her early 20s, and she had watched the documentary series when she was in high school. The series had affected her deeply, had changed her thinking about work and about family and about what mattered in life. Kate had grown up in a wealthy family. Her mother and father were both professionals, a doctor and a lawyer. They had not done manual labor. But her grandmother, her father's mother, had been a house cleaner. She had cleaned homes for wealthy families and had done this work for 40 years. She had been proud of her work, but she had also wanted something different for her children. She had encouraged Kate's father to study, to become a lawyer, to move away from the kind of work she had done. Kate's father had become a lawyer, and he had distanced himself from his mother's world. He did not talk much about where he came from. He did not acknowledge his mother's work. He acted in many ways as if his mother's labor was something to be overcome, something to move beyond. But Kate had watched the Marjorie documentaries in high school, and she had begun to think about her grandmother differently. She had begun to think about the work her grandmother had done, about the skills required, about the value of it. She had begun to be angry at her father for seeming to reject where he came from. When Kate was old enough, she had come to Ashford to visit the museum. And standing in front of Marjorie's gravestone, Kate had decided to write a letter to Marjorie. She sat in the museum's quiet room, where people could write reflections, and she wrote, "Dear Marjorie, I am writing to you from more than 700 years in the future. My name is Kate, and I am a young woman trying to figure out my life, trying to understand where I come from and what that means. My great-grandmother was a house cleaner. She cleaned homes for wealthy people, did difficult work with her hands. She was skilled and proud of her work, but she was also tired. She wanted my grandfather to have an easier life, so she encouraged him to study and to become a lawyer. He did become a lawyer, and he tried to leave behind the world of manual labor. He tried to become something different. But because of your story, because of what people like Sarah and Julia have done to preserve and honor your story, I am learning that my great-grandmother's work was not something to be ashamed of or to escape from. Her work was valuable. Her skills were real. Her hands created beauty and cleanliness and order in the world. I am angry at my grandfather for trying to deny where he came from, but I am also understanding now that he was doing what he thought was right, what he thought was necessary to give his children a better life. What I want to tell you, Marjorie, is that your story has helped me understand that we do not have to deny our history to have better lives. We do not have to reject where we come from. We can honor it, remember it, learn from it, and also move forward into something different. We can carry forward the values that were embedded in our ancestors' work, the care, the attention, the dedication, and apply those values to whatever work we do. Thank you for this teaching. Thank you for surviving your winters. Thank you for doing your work with grace. And thank you for allowing your story to live on into this future time where it continues to matter and continues to help people like me understand who we are and where we come from. With deep respect, Kate. Kate left her letter in a box provided for that purpose. Other people also left letters. There were letters from washerwomen thanking Marjorie for showing them that their work had value. There were letters from people who had been affected by watching the documentaries. There were letters from scholars and filmmakers and artists who had been inspired by Marjorie's story. There were letters from people who had never known Marjorie but who felt, through the documentary and through the pilgrimage and through the museum, that she had become part of their lives. Sarah collected these letters and published them in a book called Letters to Marjorie. It became another bestseller, another way that Marjorie's story spread further into the world. The final resting. Let me tell you about Eleanor, who was the original Eleanor, the one who had been helped by Marjorie 700 years ago, whose family had preserved the memory of Marjorie's kindness through all those centuries. Eleanor lived to be 98 years old. She lived long enough to see the documentaries made, long enough to see the museum open, long enough to see her family's story become known to thousands of people. She lived long enough to know that Marjorie would not be forgotten, that the kindness that had been shown to her so many centuries ago would be remembered and honored. Eleanor died peacefully in her sleep, in her home in Yorkshire. At her funeral, her descendants spoke about what Marjorie's story had meant to their family. They spoke about how the memory of Marjorie's kindness had shaped the way the family thought about compassion, about helping others, about doing what was right even when it was difficult. After Eleanor died, her family decided that they should donate Eleanor's papers, all the letters and documents that had been preserved through the centuries, to the Marjorie Thorne Museum. They donated them, along with a substantial gift of money to help maintain and expand the museum. The museum created a special exhibition around Eleanor's papers. It showed the original letter written by Eleanor to Marjorie, which people had seen only as a transcription before. It showed family documents spanning 700 years, showing how Eleanor's descendants had kept the memory of Marjorie alive. It showed how one act of kindness, Marjorie's response to Eleanor when she was in need, had created a chain reaction of remembrance and gratitude that had lasted longer than any dynasty, longer than any empire. The ripples spread. But the story does not end even there. The story continues to spread, to ripple outward in ways that would be impossible to fully catalog or understand. There is a young woman named Amara who grew up in a city in Nigeria. Her great-grandmother was a laundryman, a man who washed and ironed clothes for wealthy families. Amara's family had distanced themselves from that history, had tried to become middle class, and had not spoken much about where they came from. But Amara watched the Marjorie documentaries, translated into her language, and she began to think differently about her great-grandfather's work. She began to research the history of laundry work in colonial Africa, about the ways that colonialism had devalued the labor of African people. She wrote a dissertation about it, became an academic, and now teaches classes about labor history and colonialism. She has never been to Ashford, but Marjorie's story is part of what inspired her to do her work. There is a man named James who works as a mason in a small town in California. His great-great-grandmother was a domestic worker, a woman who cleaned houses and did laundry for wealthy Americans. James watched the Marjorie documentaries and decided to do something different with his masonry. He started to create sculptures out of stone, sculptures that depicted workers, people doing laundry, people building things, people engaged in the labor that created the world. He has become known for this work. Museums have purchased his sculptures. He credits Marjorie's story with inspiring him to think differently about labor, to value it, to make it visible through art. There is a group of textile artists in Peru who have created a series of weavings based on Marjorie's story. Each weaving depicts a different moment from Marjorie's life. Marjorie at the river, Marjorie with her infected hand, Marjorie training Rose. The weavings are beautiful and haunting, and they have been exhibited in galleries across South America and then internationally. The artists say that Marjorie's story resonated with them because their own ancestors had been textile workers, had created beauty through labor, and Marjorie's story helped them understand and honor that heritage. None of these people, Amara, James, the textile artists, had any direct connection to Marjorie or to Ashford, but they all were moved by her story to think differently about labor, about their own family histories, about what it means to do work with care and dedication. This, perhaps, is the real legacy of Marjorie's story. Not fame or wealth or power, but the capacity to inspire people to think differently about the ordinary work that makes life possible, to honor the labor of people who came before them, to understand that even the most humble work can be done with grace and skill and beauty. The final question. Dear friend, we have come now to a place where the story has rippled so far outward that it has touched millions of people, across continents, across centuries, across cultures. Marjorie, who began as a woman standing alone in a river in medieval England, has become something more. A symbol, a story, a touchstone for thinking about labor and value and human dignity. But I want to ask you a question, and I want you to sit with it, to think about it as you drift off to sleep. If Marjorie had known, when she was standing in that cold river 700 years ago, with her hands freezing and her body aching, that her story would one day be told to millions of people across the world, that it would inspire people in Africa and America and Peru to think differently about their own lives and their own family histories, would that have made the pain easier? Would that have made the work feel more meaningful? Or is the meaning of work something that is independent of how it is remembered, something that exists in the moment itself, in the care that is taken, in the decision to do something well even when no one is watching? I think perhaps that Marjorie never knew her story would be preserved. I think she simply did her work day after day, winter after winter, and she did it with care because that was who she was. She was kind to Elinor not because she knew it would be remembered for 700 years, but simply because Elinor needed kindness. And perhaps that is the real lesson of Marjorie's story. Not that work is meaningful because it is remembered or honored, but that work is meaningful in itself. That care is valuable in itself. That kindness matters whether or not it is ever recorded or acknowledged. This is a hard truth, perhaps. In a world that so often measures value by fame or wealth or recognition, it is hard to believe that ordinary work, done in obscurity, done without recognition, matters. But Marjorie's story suggests that it does. Marjorie's story suggests that how you do your work, how you treat the people around you, what you create with your hands, these things matter, whether they are ever known beyond the small circle of people who directly experience them. The morning comes. Dear one, the night is nearly over now. The fire has burned down to nothing. The darkness is beginning to lighten at the edges, suggesting that dawn is coming. And Marjorie's story, which began in the cold of a medieval winter, has finally come to rest, at least for now, in a kind of peace. You have stayed with me through this long night, through all the telling and retelling of Marjorie's story. You have heard about her winter, about her hands, about the infection that nearly killed her. You have heard about Elinor and Rose and Catherine and all the women who came after her. You have heard about how her story was discovered in the modern world, how it was filmed and filmed again, how it spread across the world and touched people's lives in ways that Marjorie herself could never have imagined. And you have learned, perhaps, something about the nature of stories themselves, how they persist, how they change in the telling, how they continue to matter long after the person who lived them is gone. Marjorie's hands are dust now. The river where she worked still flows, but it flows past a modern village that is very different from the medieval village where she lived. The manor house where she worked has burned and been rebuilt and changed. The people who knew her are long dead, and the people who knew the people who knew her are long dead. But her story remains. It remains in the documentaries and in the museum and in the book of letters. It remains in the hearts and minds of people who have been moved by her story, who have thought differently about their own lives because of what they learned about hers. It remains, in a very real sense, alive. And so I say to you now, dear friend, as the darkness gives way to dawn, go with Marjorie's story into your waking world. Remember her hands and what they could do and what they could endure. Remember that ordinary work done with care matters. Remember that kindness echoes forward through time, affecting people and generations that you will never meet. Remember that you are part of a long chain of people stretching backward and forward through history, all of them doing work, all of them trying to matter, all of them trying to do what they can with what they have. And if you ever find yourself doing work that seems small or insignificant, if you ever doubt whether what you are doing matters, remember Marjorie. Remember that she stood in a river 700 years ago, washing linens with her bare hands in water so cold it made her breath stop. Remember that she did that work day after day, winter after winter, and that she did it with skill and care and dedication. Remember that her story is still being told, still being read, still affecting people's lives. Your work matters, your care matters, the way you treat the people around you matters. Whether or not anyone ever writes your story down, whether or not your name is remembered, your life has value and your work has meaning. Sleep now, dear friend. The morning is coming. The sun will rise, the world will wake. And Marjorie's story, like all true stories, will continue to live on in the hearts of those who hear it and carry it forward. Sleep well, and may you, like Marjorie, find a way to do your work with grace. The final dawn, epilogue. The fire has gone out completely now. The cottage is growing light, not from any flame, but from the pale gray of approaching dawn filtering through the small window. And with that light comes the knowledge that all stories, no matter how long they are told, must eventually come to an end. Not because there is nothing more to say, but because at some point the listener must wake, and the dreamer must return to the waking world. So let me bring this story to its true conclusion, dear friend. Let me give you the ending that Marjorie deserves, and that you deserve as well. The last thing Marjorie saw. On a spring morning in the year 1374, when Marjorie Thorne was nearly 60 years old, she woke in her small cottage and knew that something had changed. The light was different. The quality of the air was different. The pain in her hands, which had been her constant companion for so many years that she barely noticed it anymore, was suddenly sharper, more insistent. She was dying. She did not need a physician to tell her this. Her body was telling her. The winter had been long that year, and it had taken something from her that could not be returned. Her heart was beating irregularly, missing beats, laboring. Her breath came short. Her hands, when she looked at them, seemed to be becoming transparent, as if they were already fading from the world. Marjorie did not feel afraid. She had lived a long time. She had survived things that should have killed her. She had done work that mattered. She had been kind. She had no regrets that she could name. She rose from her pallet and moved to her small window, looking out at the spring morning. The garden was beginning to grow green. The birds were singing. The world was full of life, continuing on its way, indifferent to the fact that Marjorie was dying. She thought about Alina, wondering if Alina had lived a good life, if the kindness that had been extended to her so many years ago had borne fruit in her existence. She thought about Rose, hoping that Rose was well, that Rose was continuing to do the work with the same care and attention that Marjorie had tried to instill in her. She thought about her mother, whom she had not seen in 15 years, wondering if her mother was somehow aware that her daughter was about to join her in whatever comes after this life. And she thought about her hands, which had been the instrument of her life's work, which had been damaged and scarred and weak, but which had continued to do what was asked of them. Her hands, which had washed linens in rivers and had cared for people and had done work that mattered. As the morning light grew stronger, Marjorie sat by her window and waited. She was not afraid of death. Death was simply the next thing, the next season after the long winter of her life. She was ready. The remembrance. Marjorie died quietly, sometime in the afternoon of that spring day. Alice, the servant from the manor house, found her when she came to check on her, something she had done every few days for years, ever since Marjorie's illness in that terrible winter so long ago. Alice closed Marjorie's eyes and whispered a prayer. Then she went to the manor house to inform Lady Catherine. The news spread through the village as it always did, through servants who gossiped, through women who came to the market, through the priest who would need to arrange the funeral. When Alina heard that Marjorie had died, she wept. She was an old woman now herself, with grown children and grandchildren. But she had never forgotten the washerwoman who had helped her, who had kept her secret, who had shown her what grace looked like. Alina came to Marjorie's funeral, which was a small thing, perhaps 100 people gathering in the churchyard on a cool spring morning. The priest said the words. The gravediggers lowered Marjorie's body into the earth. The people dispersed, going back to their lives, back to their work. But Alina remained, standing at the grave long after the others had gone. She stood there and whispered words that only Marjorie could hear, or perhaps that only the wind could hear, or perhaps that existed only in Alina's own heart. She stood there and made a promise, not for the first time but with renewed commitment, that she would not forget, that she would tell the story, that she would ensure that Marjorie's kindness, Marjorie's skill, Marjorie's grace would not be forgotten. And Alina kept that promise. She told the story to her children. They told it to their children. It was told across generations, like a treasured object passed from hand to hand, like a flame kept alive through the centuries. The wisdom of hands. Dear friend, now we have come to the true end of Marjorie's story, to the end that was always inevitable, the return to the earth from which all things come. But this is not really an ending, is it? It is simply a transformation. Marjorie's hands have returned to dust. but the work that her hands did continues. The techniques she learned, the care she taught, the way of approaching labor with dedication and attention, all of that continues. It flows forward through Rose and Catherine and through all the other people who learned from Marjorie, either directly or through the generations that came after. It flows forward to you. Yes, even to you, dear friend who has sat with me through this long night of storytelling. It flows forward to everyone who reads this story, who hears about Marjorie, who thinks about the labor of ordinary people, who begins to see the workers around them not as background, but as people with real skills and real value. This is how we become immortal, not through fame or monuments, but through the continuation of our work, through the people we have touched, through the care we have shown that becomes embedded in the world and continues to ripple forward through time. Marjorie Thorne was one woman. She lived in a small village. She did work that was considered humble and ordinary. She was not famous. She did not write books or create art that was preserved in museums. She did not do anything that would have made her famous in her own time. And yet, nearly 700 years later, her story is still being told. It has been told so many times in so many different ways that it has become larger than anyone telling. It has become a story that belongs to everyone who has heard it, everyone who has been moved by it, everyone who has carried it forward. The meaning of the work. Let me tell you what I believe Marjorie's story means, or at least what I believe it means to me, and perhaps it will mean something similar to you. I believe that Marjorie's story teaches us that work, ordinary, necessary, humble work, has value in itself. It teaches us that the way you do your work matters, not because anyone is watching or because you will be rewarded for it, but simply because the way you do things is a form of speech. It is how you say to the world, "This is who I am. This is what I value. This is what I believe matters." I believe that Marjorie's story teaches us about resilience, not the kind of resilience that never breaks, but the kind that continues even when you are broken. Marjorie's hands failed her. They could no longer do the work she had done for decades, but she found a way to continue anyway, to adapt, to keep working in a different way. This is what all of us must learn to do eventually. We must all learn to adapt to the ways our bodies fail us, the ways our circumstances change, the ways that what we thought would be our lives is not what actually unfolds. I believe that Marjorie's story teaches us about kindness, specifically, the kind of kindness that is extended without expectation of reward or recognition. Marjorie was kind to Alina not because she knew it would be remembered, not because Alina could repay her, but simply because Alina needed help. This is the highest form of kindness, the kind that is given freely, that asks nothing in return, that exists simply for its own sake. I believe that Marjorie's story teaches us about memory, about the importance of remembering the people who came before us, about honoring their labor, about ensuring that their lives and their work are not completely erased by time. Every person who has ever lived has been part of creating the world we live in now. Every person who has ever done work has contributed something to the accumulation of human knowledge and human skill. To forget them, is a kind of tragedy. To remember them is a kind of grace. What Marjorie would say. If Marjorie could speak to you now across the centuries, I believe she would not say anything grand or eloquent. I believe she would say something simple. She would say, do your work. Whatever work is given to you to do it well. Do not worry too much about whether it is valued by others, because that is not something you can control. But do know that how you do your work matters. It matters to the people who receive the fruits of your labor. It matters to you because it shapes who you become. And it matters to the future because your work becomes part of the accumulated wisdom and skill of the world. She would say, be kind. Be kind to people who are struggling. Be kind to people who are doing difficult work. Be kind to people who are different from you. Be kind not because you expect to be repaid, but because kindness is worth doing for its own sake. Kindness echoes forward through time in ways you cannot predict or control, but trust that it matters. She would say, take care of your hands. Your hands are the instruments through which you engage with the world. They deserve respect and care, even as you use them to do work. Even as they age and fail you, treat them with gentleness and gratitude. She would say, remember that you are not alone. You are part of a vast chain of people stretching backward and forward through time, all of them doing work, all of them trying to matter, all of them leaving marks on the world. When you feel lonely or insignificant, remember that you are connected to all of them, that you are continuing their work, and that someday, perhaps, someone will continue yours. The gift of the story. Dear friend, it is nearly dawn now. The darkness has given way to the pale gray that comes just before sunrise. Soon the sun will appear on the horizon, and the day will begin. The waking world will call to you. Your duties will demand your attention. You will rise from this place of rest and return to your life. But before you go, I want you to take something with you. I want you to take Marjorie's story. I want you to carry it in your heart and in your mind. I want you to think about it on difficult days when your work seems hard or unappreciated. I want you to think about it when you are tempted to judge people for the work they do, to remember that all necessary work has value. I want you to think about it when you encounter someone who is struggling, and let it remind you to be kind. This story was given to you as a gift, not because you deserved it, not because you earned it, but simply because someone wanted to give you something beautiful and true and meaningful. And now I want to ask you to pass it on. Tell this story to someone else. Let it live in their heart as it now lives in yours. Be one of the links in the chain of remembrance that keeps Marjorie alive, 700 years after her death, so far from the river where she worked, so far from the time when she lived. This is how stories survive. This is how people survive, even when their names are forgotten, even when their graves are neglected. They survive through telling. They survive through the hearts of people who care enough to remember, to honor, to pass on what was given to them. The last words. As the sun begins to appear on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I want to give you a final image to carry with you into your waking day. Imagine Marjorie, young again, in the spring of her life, standing in the river where she worked. The water is cool around her legs. Her hands are in the water, strong and unmarked by scars. She is washing linens, doing work that is simple and necessary and good. Above her, the willows are growing green. The sun is warm on her face. The river is singing as it flows. She does not know what the future holds. She does not know about the infection that will damage her hands, the winter that will nearly kill her, the way that her story will be told and retold across centuries until it reaches you here now in this moment. She is simply present. She is simply doing her work. She is simply being in the world, doing what needs to be done, the way that millions of people do every day. And this, I believe, is enough. This presence, this dedication, this care, it is enough to echo forward through time, to touch the lives of people you will never meet, to make a difference in a world you cannot see. This is what Marjorie teaches us. Not that your name will be remembered, not that you will be famous or rich or powerful. But if you do your work with care, if you treat people with kindness, if you show up and do what is asked of you and give it your best attention, then you will matter. You will have been part of something larger than yourself. You will have contributed to the accumulation of human goodness and human skill that makes life worth living. Go now with peace. The sun is rising. The birds are singing their morning songs. The world is waking. It is time for you to wake as well, to return to your life, to return to your work. But go with Marjorie's story in your heart. Go knowing that ordinary work, done with care, matters. Go knowing that you are connected to people who came before you and people who will come after you. All of you together creating the world, creating meaning, creating something that echoes forward through time. Go and do your work, whatever it is. Do it well. Be kind. Remember that you matter, not because anyone is watching or because you will be rewarded, but because you are here, you are alive, and you are doing what you can with what you have. This is enough. This has always been enough. This is what Marjorie learned standing in her river through all those winters. This is what she would want you to know. Go now, dear friend. The night of storytelling is over. The day is beginning. And Marjorie's story, like all true stories, will continue to live, will continue to matter, will continue to echo forward through the hearts of those who remember. Sleep well now, as you transition from this dream of Marjorie's life back into your own. And may you carry her with you always, her hands, her work, her grace, her kindness. May you remember that you are never truly alone, that you are always part of something larger, that the work you do echoes forward in ways you cannot see. The story is finished. The washerwoman's winter has ended. But her legacy continues forever in all the hands that remember to do their work with care. Rest now, dear one. The sun is rising. A new day is beginning. And Marjorie Thorne, washerwoman of Ashford, her work finally done, rests in the peace she earned through a lifetime of dedication, care, and grace. Finis.